Was it a family curse that caused the unthinkable tragedy that happened to this beautiful family, or the unshakable desire to fulfill addiction, which perpetuated crimes and led to neglect in a continuous downward spiral? I encourage you to hear everything, so please stay. We have to start the story with Christine and Don Spirit. Christine married Don Spirit on December 10th, 1988. They had 3 children together: Sarah Lorraine, born January 14th, 1986, and she was born with only 1 kidney; Josh, born in 1990, and Kyle Matthew, born on June 2nd, 1992. The Spirits were told that Sarah would lead a normal life even though she only had 1 kidney, and she shouldn't experience any issues. There was a chance of some slight loss in kidney function later in life, but this usually wasn't seen until about 25 years later. Don was a New Jersey native, and what is known is that the Spirit family had been living in Florida since 1995. Don seemed to get himself in trouble with the law quite a bit. I don't have information on his childhood, but if I were to guess from what we know about similar cases, I'd say he probably didn't have the best upbringing. The past could be repeating itself in this case, over and over again. Don was convicted twice in South Jersey in 1987, just a year after his daughter Sarah was born. He pled guilty to 2 separate charges. One was theft by unlawful taking, and the other was a weapons offense. There may have been more offenses before this date as well, but the convictions that are known after the ones I just mentioned happened between 1989 and the year 2000. Don was arrested at least 13 times and charged with various misdemeanors and felonies. The charges included battery, drug possession, allowing a child under 14 to operate a boat, drunk driving, depriving a child of food and shelter, even driving without a license in a hit and run, leaving the scene of an accident involving a death. It's safe to assume Sarah, Josh, and Kyle were not growing up in the safest household or with the best role models. Christine did not have it easy either. Domestic abuse was apparently a regular part of her relationship with Don, and her kids witnessed this, giving them a false reality of what a healthy relationship looked like. This wasn't the occasional pushing or shoving. Don seemed to have a bad anger problem and could become very violent. In 2002, he smashed Christine's car with a sledgehammer, and he broke all the windows in the vehicle after threatening to kill her. When questioned by the police, Christine told officers she was afraid of her husband, but when they asked her to make a formal statement about the violence that Don directed at her, the officers said she refused. In many similar cases, the abused are afraid to leave or press charges because the system doesn't always protect them. They fear it will make matters worse, so they stay quiet. Christine decided not to prosecute Don, and instead, he admitted himself for a mental health examination. Doctors diagnosed him with severe bipolar 1. It seemed like he could switch from normal to having extreme, uncontrollable outbursts, yet he would refuse to take or stay on medication. This incident with Christine's car was just a year after Don killed his son. Yes, Don killed his son Kyle. Kyle was only 9, and it's a sad story. It may have been the beginning of a wave that sent ripples through the Spirit family's future. The Spirits were living in a small single-family home in Tampa, Florida. This is what it looks like today. It had 3 small bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. Kyle and Josh shared a room, and there was a big backyard for the children to play in. Like any mother, Christine loved her youngest son so much. She used to call Kyle Sweet Pumpkin Pie. When Kyle was just a toddler, he asked his mom to call him Applejacks, and that remained his nickname after that. It didn't matter what you called him. Kyle was a sweet, loving boy. He loved to go fishing, play soccer, basketball, and dreamed of playing in the NFL. Kyle wanted to do things with the boys. He didn't want to be left out. That was the first step in a series of events that would lead to his death. In 2001, Don planned a week-long hunting trip to Three Lakes Wildlife Management Area, close to the rural town called Kenansville. It's located in Osceola County, which is 50 miles southeast of Orlando in South Florida. Don typically brought Josh along on his hunting trips. Josh was 11 at the time, and Kyle was only 9. Don didn't think Kyle was old enough to accompany them, but Kyle begged Don to let him come. He said that Josh always got to do the fun stuff while he had to stay behind. Don told him he could come if he promised he would remain in the hunting stands watching. He could not handle a gun or hunt with them. Kyle would need to stay there for hours at a time, so Don didn't think this would be much fun, but he gave in and let him go under those conditions. What do you think? Did you grow up around guns? Do you know how to shoot a gun? When was the first time you handled a gun, if you have? After the recent Oxford High School incident, some are questioning whether parents should allow children under the age of 18 to handle a firearm. After all, it is a deadly weapon. Is their frontal lobe developed enough to make adult decisions? That's the question. You tell me. Kyle didn't mind waiting around and watching because he loved animals and the forest. He could stare out into nature for hours and be entertained. Don was 38 at the time, and let's not forget, he was a convicted felon. Therefore, he was actually not legally allowed to own a firearm, but he did. Don purchased it from Christine's brother. What was interesting to me is that he was able to secure a hunting permit. You would think they would need to see something or check something to know that you were allowed to have a firearm. Don notified the school that both boys would be out for a few days. They piled into Don's red, white, and blue Nissan pickup truck with the window sticker that read, "I'd rather be hunting." They arrived at the area on Thursday, November 8th. They had a couple of days to settle in and hang out before deer season opened on Saturday. They planned to stay until Wednesday, November 14th. They were waking up around 5:30 every morning to begin hunting. All three of them were wearing bright orange clothing that's used to prevent accidental shootings. Don had a .300 Browning Magnum rifle, and Josh was carrying a .270. Kyle did as Don instructed and walked along with them, scoping out the area, unarmed. He did not touch a firearm the entire trip. On Tuesday, their last night there, Don cooked a big meal: pork chops, green beans, potatoes, and corn, because he didn't plan on hunting the next day. He figured, we'll have a big meal and we'll sleep in. As he had expected, Don was tired on Wednesday morning. He didn't plan on hunting, and he didn't feel like hunting that day, but the boys wanted to go into the woods. So he drove them to a really good spot, and they went on a 2-hour walk. Unfortunately, they had not had the opportunity to shoot even one deer the entire trip. And by the time Wednesday came around, it was gloomy and rainy, and Don just wanted to get back home. So he began packing up as planned. As Don packed the truck, he put Josh's rifle into its case and proceeded to clean his stays to do the same. Half talking to the boys and half talking to himself, he said something to the effect of, "Would you look at that? There's rust on the muzzle of the barrel." He began to take his thumb and polish that area. He was rubbing some oil into it, and this was to remove the rust, not realizing that Kyle would actually come face to face with the weapon to look at it. As Don tried to position it back in the case, he accidentally bumped the trigger, trying to get it in. Kyle was shot in the head at point-blank range. Don was obviously in absolute shock about what had just happened. It happened so fast there was nothing he could do. There was no way to know what would happen. Don was frantic. He grabbed his phone and tried to call 911. Meanwhile, Josh was right there. He was witnessing the entire thing, and there was no cell service. The area was way too remote. So, Don threw Kyle in the back of his pickup truck and raced back to the campsite as fast as he could. A man named Mike Evans, a 46-year-old from Fort Pierce, was driving out of the woods when he saw Don speeding up behind him. He didn't know what was going on, so he pulled over to let Don pass. That's when he saw Kyle in the flatbed. He could tell that Kyle was most likely fatally injured. He later said it was the most horrifying thing he had ever seen. Evans decided to speed up and follow Don. Hunters were outside the campsite, and by this time, Don was able to get a hold of Christine. She went ahead and called the Osceola County Sheriff's Office to meet him at the campsite. The hunters saw Don screaming, and they ran towards him to help him out. Many of them were also calling for help. Don dropped to his knees and screamed. People said he was screaming, "Why me?" Evans was scared that Don might take his own life, so he and some other hunters decided to grab Don and take him away from Kyle's body. Others tried to make sure that Josh was okay. It must have been absolutely horrifying to see all of this play out in front of you with no way to help. Evans looked Josh in the eyes, held him by his shoulders, and told him to be strong for his parents. He said, "Now you have to be a man sooner than most." The paramedics arrived, but it was clear there was nothing they could do for Kyle. Detective Kerwin King explained it was a high-powered rifle. You could only imagine what it had done. A family allowed Josh and Don to stay in their camper until authorities figured out what to do next. Everyone that was at the campsite was in shock. Don was a complete wreck. He said he knew the gun was loaded, he just thought he had the safety on. He was adamant his hand never got near the trigger. It's so sad, it's so horrible. There's so much that goes into being a gun owner. So many steps to make sure everything is safe. Some of the hunters that were there that night said they wish there were more signs around the woods reminding hunters about gun safety. Others said they don't think anything could have been done to prevent it. It was an accident, but was it? What do you think? Was this an unfortunate accident, or did something happen between Don and Kyle? Was there something that set Don off that day? Was Kyle begging Don to stay, to hunt, to hold a gun? A part of me truly believes this was never intended, but it would change the course of Don's life forever, and not just because Kyle wouldn't be there anymore, but because it changed something in Don that day.
Spirit accidentally shot and killed his 8-year-old son, Kyle, during what he called a hunting accident. That happened in November 14th during a hunting trip to Kenansville. That's about an hour southeast of Orlando. According to a 2003 article in the Orlando Sentinel, Spirit was walking through the woods with Kyle and his other son, Josh. He pointed out rust on the muzzle of his high-powered rifle, and that rifle fired, hitting Kyle in the head. Spirit says he drove for miles with Kyle in the back of his truck looking for help.
Just a day later, reporters were already over at Christina and Don's home. Christine agreed to let a reporter in to speak with her. She was completely beside herself. She explained they were having a really difficult time coping. Christine told the reporter it was way too hard to talk about and that it's just been devastating, especially for Don. Christine said he was having a very hard time and that she was really worried about him. I can only imagine. It's too horrible to even think about. You have just taken the life of someone you gave life to. Christine went on to explain they didn't even have enough money to pay for Kyle's funeral expenses. She wanted to make sure that everyone knew who Kyle was. She told the reporter that he had saved his allowance to buy a bike. He'd been saving for months, and he finally found one on clearance that was only $32. He used the remaining money to buy a bike for his brother, Josh. That's the type of kid Kyle was. He was a really good kid, and they missed him so much already. By November 17th, Don agreed to do an interview regarding Kyle's death. He told reporters that he wasn't going to bring Kyle on the trip, but he relented. He explained that Kyle loved animals and the forest. Don was sobbing through these words. He went on to say that made it even worse because Kyle was at a place he loved, and that would be the last time he would see any of that again. The reporter said that Don would switch between coherently explaining what happened and uncontrollably sobbing. All the while, Christine is right by his side. She's comforting him, rubbing his arm lovingly, and trying her hardest not to cry. Don kept repeating that it just happened so fast, and he didn't have time to think. He kept quickly shaking his head from side to side as he repeated that over and over again. He kept saying, "It's just unbelievable." He did this a number of times as though he was trying to shake the memories away. He sobbed even more when he explained that Josh saw everything. He regrets that he couldn't think clearly enough in the moment to tell Josh to stand back or to look away. Can you imagine? That would haunt you for the rest of your life. Josh actually came out of his room and sat down next to his dad. He hugged him. He told the reporter that they missed Kyle so much. One thing Don didn't forget to mention was that he knows he has been in trouble with the law, but he does not do drugs anymore. He did bring a 12-pack of beer on the trip, but he only had 3 of them the entire trip. He didn't drink any on the day of the shooting. At the end of the interview, Don said this: "I may not have lived the best life, but I know that this was an accident. I know none of that matters when it comes to my son being dead. Dead because something went really wrong." What do you think? At this point, investigators were looking into Don's past, especially his felony conviction he had in 1998 for the possession of marijuana over 20 grams. Convicted felons are not permitted to own guns, and he knew that. Yet, He went out of his way to buy one without leaving a paper trail. By the way, I don't know about you, but I was curious, so here's what 1 gram of marijuana looks like. With only 8 more grams, he would have had 1 ounce. And this is what 1 ounce looks like. Therefore, it was actually presumed that Don was selling it and not just carrying it around for personal use. After this hunting tragedy, free gun safety classes began to fill up in Osceola County. These classes were for both adults and children. They were conducted by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. I was actually surprised to read that the director of hunter education said that kindergarten was when children should start to learn about gun safety. I guess it makes sense if you're thinking about toy guns and video games. Kids do need to know in advance that guns are dangerous and that the real ones are not to play with. I was initially thinking, when I read it, that he meant kindergartners should be learning how to shoot guns at 4 or 5 years old. Again, I am not well versed in hunting or guns in general, so this may be the norm. One of the National Rifle Association certified instructors, Bob Greer, said that many gun owners become complacent. They think they know how to handle a gun safely and properly, but at times when they take the classes, they find out they were mistaken. It takes hours for gun safety to become second nature. That way, in spur-of-the-moment situations, your muscle memory kicks in. Don and Christine decided to move out of their home, which brought back way too many memories, and start fresh, leaving Tampa and moving to Bell, Florida. Bell is a small rural community in North Florida. It only has about 500 residents, I think less back when this happened, and it's located in Gilchrist County. The town was founded in the 1890s. It was named after a beauty pageant winner, Belle Fletcher. Maybe that was the most important thing that happened in this town, because it's so small. I can only imagine how much smaller it would have been back then. And I'm not trying to be facetious. You'll see what I mean. The per capita income in Bell is only about $12,000. Around 13% of the families and 17% of the population were below the poverty line. 19% of those were under the age of 18. This town is also 95% white, and it reminds me a lot of the town of Santa Claus, Georgia, that I talked about in the Daniels family slayings. I was curious about why they would pick Bell. This is a place that grows peanuts. There are cows roaming around in fields, and this is where more tragedy will occur. There's just so much land and not a whole lot to do, except maybe fishing and hunting. All I see when I look at this map is springs, swamps, and rivers. When I look at this picture, I promise you, I can smell it, I can feel it. The humidity, the smoke from campfires, or people's cigarettes, or a barbecue. Here's a video I found, and this is in the middle of the pandemic, so you can just imagine how packed this place is on a normal holiday weekend. Okay, so there you go. That gives you an idea of what it's like near Bell. The culture, the weather, the lifestyle, the type of people, that's it. Bell is not this exciting at all. It's 20 minutes away, and it's surrounded by mostly industrial companies, building suppliers, concrete businesses, a plantation, and just a bunch of churches. It's very hard to find work there. Residents that live there say that it's a nice, quiet, agricultural community. It's a close-knit community. If anything were to happen to any of your neighbors, someone would be so kind as to set up a donation box, and then everyone would pitch in. There are very few jobs. Most of the good ones involve things like hard labor, hauling rocks, sand, logs. Look at this. This is one of the major roads running through it. It's US 129, and these little turndowns, they're just dirt roads. Google Maps won't even let you go down these roads. But luckily, I did contact a YouTuber that drove down the road toward the spirit's home. So this is the drive to the area where the trailer was. Now I just want to point out, the location that he goes to show you is actually not Don's house. This is not the trailer that Don and his family lived in. Don's family lived in a trailer that's no longer on the property. It has been torn down. I will show you, because he is standing in front of a mailbox here, which you can see, and that is to this residence that's shown in the video. However, you have to keep making your way down, and that is where the driveway would be. Right here on the map, I can show you that's where the driveway would be. And like I said, The trailer is no longer there, but this video still gives you a feel of what it's like driving down these roads. They are desolate. There is nothing there. Even your neighbors are not really that close. Let's jump back into Don and Christine. It's common for residents in Bell to live in mobile homes on several acres, and that is what Don and Christine did too. They moved to a mobile home on 2 acres of land in Bell, which they purchased, wait for it, for only $2,204.69 back in 1996. So maybe that's why they moved there. About a year later, in 2002, Don was arrested for driving his car on a suspended license, since he had accumulated a number of convictions relating to traffic offenses, one, like I said, involving a hit and run with the death of another person. This time he was charged with what Florida refers to as a habitual felony. He was ordered to pay $43,500 in court costs, including fines. Remember, this is a family who couldn't even afford to bury their son. They did not have a lot of money. They had been struggling to make ends meet for quite some time, and they were just getting hit with blow after blow. They just couldn't get ahead. Now the authorities were really looking into Don's past, and a couple of months later, he was charged with possession of a firearm by a convicted felon in connection to Kyle's death. It took about 2 years for the case to be resolved. As soon as the trial date was set, Don actually took a plea deal. It was on January 23, 2003, in exchange for a lighter sentence. Originally, he would have been facing up to 15 years in prison if a jury had convicted him. Don was already 40 at the time, and he said he just couldn't go through such an emotional trial. Outside the courtroom, Don and Christine were just sobbing. Christine was wearing a shirt, and it had Kyle's face on it in full color, with the words "My Special Angel" and his nickname, Apple Jacks, on it. Through tears, she said she was worried about how her family would hold up with all of this. First Kyle's death, and now Don going away for 3 years. She said she didn't know how you would prepare for something like this. Then she explained how she thinks about Kyle all the time. She even kept a box full of trinkets, shoes, clothing, and all sorts of items of Kyle's to remember him. Don told the media there was nothing he could do, probably referring to the fact that he could not change what happened. Don was out on bond until his sentencing hearing on March 3rd. There was an interesting comment from Mike Saunders. He was the Deputy Felony Bureau Chief for the State Attorney's Office. He said it's a tragedy all the way around, but if Don had followed the law and not possessed a firearm, his child would not be dead. I had not really put that together for some reason, but he's got a point. No gun, no way for this to occur. Don's own public defender, Don Wagoner, said the jury would have probably found him guilty because they couldn't offer them facts not to. Don could have chosen to take the necessary legal steps after his felony to undergo a process to restore his right to own a firearm, but he chose not to. And I think I know why. Because when I was looking into it, I realized that when you have a criminal record, it's super expensive. You have to get a pardon, which includes filing an application with the state, and that requires a lawyer so you can fill it out properly. And then after that, with all the other fees, you're looking at a couple $1,000s. And it still might not be approved, considering the likelihood is much smaller if you're like Don and have more than 10 convictions. Don was sent to serve his sentence at Hamilton Correctional Institution in North Florida. Christine was constantly worried because she thought that every time the phone rang, she was going to pick it up and the prison was going to be calling her to tell her that Don had taken his life. She was so sad because her children were missing out on their father being there for important milestones, like Josh turning 13, becoming a teenager, and Sarah having their first grandchild. At this time, Don's daughter Sarah was only 17 and pregnant with her first child. Sarah had dropped out of high school in 11th grade, and she was working at a fast food restaurant and a local grocery store. She had started dating a man named Edward Neal Coleman, and their child was due in November. Now, I told you there are a lot of people in this case, so I did make a graphic. You don't have to look at the screen. I will continue telling you who everyone is. But if you want to look, there is a mind map to be seen. Don would be in prison the next 3 years and miss out on meeting and spending time with his grandchild. I am sure that this was added pain for the Spirit family. Not to mention, not having Dawn around made Christine a sudden single mother. She did find a job. She was selling life insurance to make ends meet. It was sad. Her surviving son, Joshua, was suffering from deep depression. You have to remember he witnessed it all. He saw that. I have to look at those things in my classes for death investigation. But to see someone that I love in that state and that condition, and watching it happen and play out, it would scar you for life, he said. Sarah gave birth to her first son, Caleb, on November 22, 2003. She really wanted to name her son Kyle, but Christine was against it. She told Sarah it was way too much. It would bring back a lot of memories every time she would see him or hear the name. So that was a no. On June 20th, Christine, Joshua, only 13, his friend Liam, 12, and his cousin Louie, 8, took a 3-hour drive from Bell to where Kyle was killed. Then they had to go 7 miles deep into the woods at the wildlife management area. They were there to honor Kyle for what would have been his 11th birthday. Christine had visited 2 times before and left flowers and all kinds of little trinkets, but this time it was to place a brass plaque next to an oak tree that was planted in Kyle's memory. The family was still having a hard time coping. Christine said that being there helped to remember him, especially when she was walking through the woods. She said it was hard for her to explain. Biologist H.W. Harder III was the one that was working there. He was installing the plaque and said he thinks he can explain it. It's a reminder, and accidents do happen. Okay, I think it's a little deeper than that, because people report being in nature makes them feel connected to the loved ones that passed away. Maybe it's the quiet calm or the noises that we can hear when everything's been blocked out. When all the sounds from everyday life aren't there anymore, there's just this still calm, and you can hear the sounds of nature. Have you experienced this? Because I know I have. Many times I hear people say that they can feel their loved ones when they see a butterfly or a rainbow. There's just something about being in nature that gives them a feeling of peace and connection to the deceased. If you feel inclined, tell me in the comments if you've ever experienced that. It would have been hard for Don. He couldn't be there. But Christine said at this point she felt like she had lost him as well. He was probably just a shell of who he was before. Sarah really wanted to go too, but she had just had the baby and she couldn't make a 3-hour trip. As Harder put the plaque into place, the only sound they could hear was the rhythmic beating of the rain. When Josh saw the plaque, he fell to his knees, pulled his legs up to his chest, and sat in that fetal position, continuing to cry. The group just held on to one another for support. Christine said she felt completely empty, but she had to keep it together because if she broke down, she would not be able to help the boys in her family who couldn't help themselves. She had to be that pillar and stay strong. Speaking of which, it took a lot to make this decision, but Christine filed for divorce from Don in 2005 after over 20 years together and just 1 year before he was expected to be released. Being the victim of Don's violence, Christine probably felt like it was now or never. He was locked up. She could get away and start over and be safe, and that's what she did. The same year, on April 16th, Sarah had her second child with Edward. They named her Kylie Marie, Kylie after Kyle, so this time she got her wish. Don was released from prison the next year, in 2006, and he moved back to the mobile home. He had gained sole possession of the property during the divorce. Life was a lot different when Don came back. He had 2 new grandchildren, and his daughter was only 19. She had a 3rd baby on the way. Yes, a 3rd baby, another baby with Edward. All that responsibility, his wife gone, having to fend for himself without his family, plus having to figure out how to reconnect and fit himself into his children's worlds. Sarah was not doing well. Edward was always in trouble with the law, and she had been experimenting with drugs, plus hanging out with a bad crowd. She was also responsible for looking after her younger brother, Josh. At this time, do you think that having a father like Don made Sarah attracted to men that were similar to him? Because I see that happening sometimes. It doesn't make sense because you'd think, you know you can do better, but it happens. What do you think about Sarah having a third child? People can choose to do whatever they want, but it's hard, very hard. Children are a huge responsibility, not to mention the extra expenses. And she was practically a child herself. She's only 19. Her boyfriend's not doing much. He's proving to be very unreliable. She couldn't work since she couldn't afford daycare, and she had those kids. This left her parents or anyone around her to help pick up the slack. I remember in the comments of my video about the Daniels family, someone said that one of the women should not have had children because she was a drug addict. I tried to explain that many times individuals on welfare or struggling with finances don't have equal access to birth control. They may have never even learned about the various methods. Other people actually choose to have many children so that they can take advantage of money benefits from the state. I'm from Florida. I can attest to the state giving a decent amount of money, food stamps, and all kinds of services to moms, especially single moms, and even more so if you have more than one child. The more children you have, the more benefits you receive. But we'll never know why Sarah wanted to have more children. She gave birth to her third child, Jonathan Neal Coleman, on March 19, 2006. But at this point, even as happy as they were facing eviction, and they had no food in their house. That same year, the Department of Children and Families, DCF, was called. A neighbor found Sarah's oldest child, Caleb, with bite marks and bruises, and he was wandering the streets with a steak knife. The neighbor told the DCF that Sarah used drugs like crazy and was constantly leaving her children in cracked ends. A DCF report that I read from August 21, 2006, indicates that both Sarah and Edward were allegedly perpetrators against their children regarding endangerment, which could have included injuries. When the caseworkers arrived, they noticed that 2-year-old Jonathan was in a cast. He had a cast on his leg. Sarah was trying to explain that he fell off a trampoline. As the investigators were questioning her, they asked her why a baby his age would be allowed on the trampoline. And then they asked where it was, and there was no trampoline. Evidence showed they didn't believe Sarah, yet they did nothing to make sure that these children were safe from harm. There was another report a few months earlier that Edward had beaten Sarah in front of the children. No ongoing services were provided to the family. Their caseworker concluded that the children were not in danger, and therefore they were not removed. They didn't think that Edward and Sarah were causing the injuries to the children, so the case was closed. By 2007, the DCF had referred Sarah to get help to voluntarily obtain the services she might need. They could teach her how to be a better mom. They could give her different resources so she could learn what to do differently, but she refused. Edward was in and out of jail, and she was bouncing around between Christine's house and Dawn's house. Anytime Edward was not around, Sarah usually ended up at Dawn's. The DCF was continuing to receive reports that these children were at risk for abuse and neglect. The calls to the DCF hotline included allegations of substance abuse, domestic violence, medical neglect, and inadequate supervision of these children. Sarah would leave the children with relatives and wouldn't return. She wouldn't contact them for days or even weeks at a time. In February 2007, reports showed that Sarah was ordered to relinquish custody of her children, and I was like, finally, these children are going to be removed. But not for long. She signed a power of attorney, relegating the children's care to other family members. The children were given to different caretakers, which I thought was a little bit odd, but I don't have all of the details. I know Christine, that's Sarah's mom, took Caleb, and a woman named Linda Dickinson, I don't know the relation, took Kylie and Jonathan, who went to a woman named Tammy Sassani, who's related to the Spirit family. These children did not have it easy. That's an understatement. They had been tossed around and cared for by many different people. That's a lot of instability for such young children who need a lot of structure and attention. It seems like 2007 was the start of a complete downward spiral, not only for Sarah, but also where her brother Josh Spirit's criminal record begins. There's burglary, larceny, and it does not end there. Josh seems to continue to get in trouble with the law, just like his dad and his sister. I found the Facebook pages for almost everyone in this case, and here's a picture of Josh. This is from his Facebook. Notice he has a tattoo commemorating his brother Kyle. He has another tattoo that reads, "There is no safer place to be than in God's loving hands, safer in death than in life." I guess, sadly, that seems to ring true in this case. Just a month after handing the kids over, the DCF allows them to be returned to Sarah, and now she's being investigated again, this time for inadequate supervision relating to Caleb and threatening to harm Jonathan. The DCF finally says, okay, we need to provide some services, so they provide what's called in-home services with a community-based agency called Partnership for Strong Families. So we have the DCF and we have the PSF. The PSF is contracted by the DCF to deliver comprehensive child welfare services to children who are victims of abuse and neglect. I'm going to be going into this a little bit, you may or may not care, but there are definitely obvious systematic issues with the way the DCF handled this case. I've always wondered this, and I finally found out that the process in Florida is that they have an abuse hotline that's open 24/7, so someone has to call it to make a report. The DCF investigates and screens out situations that don't meet the state's definition of maltreatment because they want to know, are we wasting our time, or is this for real? So they kind of do a welfare check. If the issues are verified, then the PSF will come in to do these in-home services, which include interviewing the children, the parents, counseling sessions, a care plan, etc. But there's really not somebody there watching. Instead, parents can even refuse the services. They're either voluntary or involuntary, and these are voluntary services. You can take them or leave them. However, if they do refuse, they at the very least have to provide the contact information of a family member. And then that person kind of becomes the third party, the extra person responsible. They have to agree that they're going to make sure everything's going to be okay. Not that reliable, especially when you have family members who are doing just as poorly as you are. Otherwise, the PSF will be there working on the case, but it doesn't say how often they're there. Once a day? I don't think so. Are they there once a month? I don't know. It says that they provide assistance with food, housing, rent, utilities, clothing, medical care, transportation, employment, legal services, substance abuse, and mental health care, crisis intervention. You get the idea. They even help with family planning. So if she didn't want to have any more children, this would be the time she would become educated and get on birth control. I wanted to showcase this process, so I found a video following a caseworker around, and she is here explaining her job and what it's like to have the responsibility that is put on these caseworkers.
Last year, the statewide child abuse hotline received over 310,000 calls. Child protective investigators are then tasked with what can become life and death decisions. Such cases can range from parenting advice to the more serious allegations of abuse and neglect.
Their child is almost like their property, they don't want anyone to tell them anything.
The job demands long hours and difficult decisions.
I think about that all the time. I wonder if did we make the right decision? Is there anything else we can do, That's what I tell the new people. You can't get it out of your head because you're always thinking about that child and did you make the right decision for that child?
That's a lot of weight on a person's shoulders, and it proves to be too much for the workers in this case. Edward's mother tried to alert the DCF to the fact that the children were being neglected. Once again, she notified them her grandson Caleb was so hungry he was hoarding food. He didn't know when he was going to get fed next. She said no child should go through that. This time, she threatened to call the media if the DCF refused to step in. It's weird because reports show that when the caseworkers came to check on Sarah and the kids would be dressed well, they looked happy, they were clean. But I keep thinking, looks can be deceiving. There are so many pictures of these beautiful children, and Sarah's beautiful, she's a beautiful woman. She's got these big blue eyes, this really pretty smile, and her kids are absolutely adorable. I'm guessing that she knew how to charm the caseworkers and make believe everything was fine. Just a year later, in 2008, Sarah was pregnant once again. This is her fourth child, and this time it's with another man. His name is James Stewart. Most people refer to him as Jamie, so that's what I'm going to do too. He was also in and out of jail, not a steady fixture in their lives. There was a report in February that Jamie had been abusing substances in the home with the children there. The DCF concluded that he had to enter a treatment facility and provide power of attorney to Christine. Sarah, Jamie, and the kids were living in a shack. It was a very small structure in the back of Jamie's family's property. One of the neighbors said that Sarah would come over all the time, knocking on their door, asking for food or diapers. She didn't have anything. I thought that at this point, from what I could gather on police reports, her 3 other children's father, Edward, was facing a number of years in prison, so it's safe to assume he wouldn't be part of Sarah's or the kids' lives for long, if ever. Sarah moved to Christine's house in Fort Pierce, Florida, and while she was there, she was charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor in March. She was 22 at the time, and there was an 18-year-old living there as well. She might have gotten caught buying him alcohol. That's the only thing I can think of. I can't find any information on it, just the charge, and the 18-year-old was named Christopher Jeffers. I know that Christine has the last name Jeffers as well, so they had to be related, but I don't know how. Just 3 months later, in June, Sarah was once again charged in connection to stealing when she was caught shoplifting at a retail store. This was a subsequent offense, which carried additional fines and consequences. By August 27, 2008, Sarah was living with Dawn again. She was 8 months pregnant when she called the police to let them know Dawn was beating her up in front of her 3-year-old daughter, Kylie. He was also threatening to beat up Kylie and Jonathan. She told police that she was very scared of him. He was 6 feet 2 inches and weighed over 200 pounds. She told them, "I know what he's capable of." When an officer arrived on the scene, he found Sarah visibly shaken, with red marks on both sides of her face. She said that Dawn became enraged. She was telling him she couldn't afford to pay his taxes for his property where they both lived. Sarah could hardly take care of herself. She was unemployed, and she had nowhere to go. She was sitting there trying to reason with her dad, telling him, "I'm gonna get the money. My friends are gonna help me." But apparently, Dawn either didn't believe her, or he could have just been fed up. All of a sudden, she said he grabbed her by the arms, shoved her up against the refrigerator, and then he took both of his hands and placed them on the sides of her face, squeezing her cheeks together really hard. You could see there were red marks just below her eyes on her face, like fingerprints.
In 2008, Spirit was arrested for aggravated assault on his then-pregnant daughter, Sarah.
A police report the I-Team obtained from Gilchrist County Circuit Court says Sarah was 38 weeks pregnant with her daughter Destiny when Don Spirit shoved her against a refrigerator and boxed her cheeks.
Do you recall if you were following the Gabby Petito case when she explained to the officers what Brian Laundrie had done to her? He had grabbed her face and pushed her. It's so similar, and it's so sad. Sarah told police that Dawn threatened to make her life a living hell if she ever reported him. But this time she did. She said she needed a restraining order against him because he was starting to become physical with her children. He was hitting them with belts until they were black and blue. When Gilchrist County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the mobile home the next day to arrest Dawn, of course he refused to come out. He told them, quote, "The only way you're going to get in here is to break down the door and throw in tear gas." But eventually, he gave up, and he was taken into custody. He was later sentenced to 6 months in jail. Sarah's 4th child, Destiny Nicole Stewart, was born just 1 month after this incident, on September 27, 2008, completely healthy, beautiful little girl. Just weeks later, Sarah is writing a letter to the court. I have some of it right here that I saw on the news, and she's sitting there asking for leniency in her dad's case, taking the blame for what happened. Part of the letter says, quote, "I forgive him for what he did, and I'm willing to stand by his side and help him through his problems."
While Don was awaiting trial, Sarah wrote a letter to the judge asking that he not be sent back to prison. She said, "I love my father. He's the only family I have, and he's a big part of mine and my children's life." The letter said that since Spirit accidentally killed her brother Kyle, he hadn't been emotionally or mentally stable. She also said he will die if he goes to prison, and it would kill me to know I put him there.
I personally think this was a result of her being alone with all of her children. She was in desperate need of support, so at this point, she doesn't even care if it's her abusive father. She just needs somebody. That wasn't the first time that this happened. There were a number of violent incidents between Sarah and Don from the moment that he got out of prison, probably even before he went to prison, considering the way he treated Christine. Many of the reports included details about how Don would constantly terrorize his family. Don had issues with his anger in the past. He would blow up and act with violence out of nowhere. Sarah said he had a violent temper, and she was scared of him. She must not have been that scared, or her desperation outweighed her fear because she never showed up for the hearing. The petition was dismissed by refusing to testify against him, and a court domestic violence protection order was dropped, which opened her up to the possibility of suffering more abuse. By this time, Sarah had also been in trouble with the law a number of times herself. Her first offense dates all the way back to 2000, when the spirits lived back in Tampa and she was about 13. She was charged with operating a boat without a boater's license, and Don was also charged in this case because he was the one that allowed her to operate the vessel illegally. Sarah seemed to stay out of trouble, or at least she wasn't caught, until about 1 year after she and Don were reunited. She was charged with larceny just a couple of days after Independence Day in 2004, while she was living at Don's. It was considered a first-time offense, plus it was for items totaling less than $100, so she didn't have much in the way of consequences, if any, just a little slap on the wrist. Later that same year, in December, she was charged with burglary and trespassing, so we can assume the punishment for the first offense wasn't enough to deter her. Maybe Don contributed to Sarah's downfall. Their relationship was described by family and close friends as a tumultuous, violent father-daughter relationship, fighting one day, caring for each other the next. It was a cycle of love and hate. Jamie Stewart's aunt, Colleen, kept track of things. Jamie is the father of Sarah's third and fourth child, Destiny and Jonathan. Colleen became close to Sarah. When she was asked about Sarah and Don's relationship, she would say that one day Don wouldn't want anything to do with her and the kids, and then out of nowhere he would just bring them food and groceries and be all kind and loving. Both Colleen and her daughter Katie, who was only a teenager at the time, helped out with the kids. I pulled up Don's criminal record and found out that in 2009, Don was once again picked up for another traffic violation, this time DUI. It was reduced to reckless driving, which sounds worse, but to me, after everything else we know about his convictions in the past, it seems like nothing. Meanwhile, the man that Sarah had her first 3 children with, Edward Coleman, was now in a new relationship with another woman named Tiffany Hunt. Tiffany gave birth to their son, Edward Neil Coleman, on November 22, 2009, the same birth date as his first son, Caleb, born 6 years earlier. Sadly, just like the fate of the boy that Caleb was supposed to be named after, little Kyle Edwards' baby died just 4 months after he was born, on April 1st, 2010. It's just so sad. The baby was so little, and I searched and I couldn't find any information regarding how he died. I do know that they had a funeral service and a burial at Trinity Memorial Gardens in Pasco County, Florida. Tiffany had another child before Edward Jr., and her name was Mariah Grace Coleman. I'm not sure if she was Edwards or not, but she did have the same last name. I was able to locate who I think is Tiffany Hunt, and I got to see pictures of her and her family. She has since married and has a bunch of beautiful children. She's not married to Edward, and sadly, he couldn't be at his baby son's funeral because he was locked up. I'm just trying to give you a feel of the individuals that were surrounding these children and where they came from. That's why I'm telling you all these details. Just 2 months before this, on September 2nd, Edward was evading authorities. There was a warrant out for his arrest for a violation of probation. Fabulous. The U.S. Marshals and the Tampa Police Department created a task force to apprehend Edward. He was considered armed and dangerous, with a known history of violence. U.S. Marshal Scott Lee heard over the radio that Edward was coming out of his car and then fleeing on foot, running toward a drive-thru of a Checkers fast food restaurant. Lee was driving his car toward Coleman. He was flashing his lights, and his siren was blaring. He drove across Hillsborough Avenue. He went over the center median and drove toward the Checkers parking lot. He sees that there are no vehicles exiting the drive-thru, thank goodness. and he also sees that Coleman is in the drive-through area. Edward Coleman, I keep going back and forth, I think you know. So, Lee enters the drive-through going 15 miles per hour. That's fast, but authorities were worried because they wanted to catch him as soon as possible. There was a middle school right behind Checkers, and it was just letting out. This was a potentially armed and dangerous criminal. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, he's going 50 miles an hour. He sees him jump in front of the patrol car. He didn't have a second to stop, and Lee struck him with the vehicle. The car jumps over the curb and lands right against a retaining wall, pinning Coleman against the wall and injuring him as a result. Just like in the movies or a TV show, right after he heals, he's locked up and taken to prison. This time he's sentenced to 25 years in prison, and you probably could have guessed. Needless to say, he was never going to be involved in his children's lives again. Let's turn to Sarah's new boyfriend, James Stewart. They had their first child in 2008, which was Sarah's fourth child, Destiny Stewart. 2 years had gone by between the time that she had her third child with her previous boyfriend, Edward, who we just got done talking about. As I pointed out, Jamie wasn't on his best behavior. He was also in trouble with the law. Because they lived in such a small town, it made me think of this proverb. I'm sure you've heard it before. Idle hands are the devil's workshop. Breaking it down to its meaning, someone who's unoccupied and bored will find mischief. Someone who has nothing better to do will partake in something that will get them into trouble. James Lawson Stewart was born in December of 1990. He was only 18 when he and Sarah had their daughter, Destiny. Sarah was 22. They were so young, and I'm sure that Sarah expected Jamie to take some responsibility for her other kids as well, not just Destiny, but I'm not sure Jamie was willing, ready, or able to do so at all. He was around more before 2012, because that is when most of his criminal cases seemed to have been going to court, and he was just in and out of jail. His sister Colleen was definitely around more than he was when it came to Sarah and the kids, especially because she had her new niece, Destiny. Colleen Stewart was born in February of 1979. She was 11 years older than Jamie. Since she was closer to 30, I'm sure that Jamie and Sarah saw her as more of an adult than they were, and possibly counted on her for advice and assistance. However, Colleen had been getting in trouble with the law since at least 1998, back when she was around the same age that they were, about 19. Colleen's daughter was 11 at the time. Her name was Katie. I'm sure it was nice for Katie to play with Sarah's kids too, even though Sarah's oldest, Caleb, was only 5. Kids like to play together. Colleen and Katie spent a good deal of time either at Don's or at Jamie and Sarah's place. They became very close friends, if not best friends, and they probably considered each other family. Their closeness and their relationship come into play a bit later, and definitely had some part in the horrific events that end up occurring just 6 years later. Colleen's criminal record includes offenses for resisting arrest, larceny, theft, violence toward a police officer, and driving with a suspended license. 5 children under the age of 8, with Brandon being just a newborn that needed a lot of attention. There's no surprise DCF was once again at Sarah and Jamie's house. They just couldn't do it. They were not able to fend for themselves. It was in November when there was a report called in that Caleb had sustained burns to his body. In-home services were started once again with the PSF. Did they remove the children? No. Burns on the body. I'm not sure if it was the increasing number of children or if the children were getting older and needing more supervision. I don't know if that resulted in the continued and more intense issues that surrounded this family, and maybe it was the compounding circumstances. It was a sick cycle no one could escape. It was one thing after another. More children, more problems. They were unstable parents in poverty, unable to appropriately care for their kids. They knew that they were seen as failures by the state and by their community. Since the town was so small, neighbors from everywhere they lived had called DCF on them. Was this leading Sarah to seek comfort in drugs, which was resulting in more issues and eventually addiction? Addiction leading to needing more money to get her fix, and then using state funds to do that, overfeeding her own children? That's what I assumed. It's one theory. Those are assumptions we can make. But whatever it was, things got worse. They got so desperate for drugs that Don decided to begin growing marijuana on his property, either for self-use or to sell. In Florida, cultivating marijuana is a felony, punishable by up to 5 years in prison, as well as a $5,000 fine. Don could not afford to be doing this, but he did it. And what's worse is it becomes a first-degree felony if there are any minors living at the residence where the plants are being grown. He gets caught, but this wasn't a professional operation. There were way less than 25 plants, which is the threshold for what kind of felony you're going to get. Therefore, Don did not get sent to prison, but he did have his driver's license suspended for another 6 months. Don even tried to sue both Sarah and her ex, Edward, for child support. Kylie had just started kindergarten at Bell Elementary School. Caleb was already attending school, and the teachers were very familiar with the Spirit family, as they had been dealing with previous issues regarding Caleb's well-being. There was a time when he reported they had no electricity in the trailer. This poor little boy told teachers that the adults got to eat good dinners. They got to have steak and chicken, but the kids were only allowed to eat ramen noodles or cereal. School was also notified that both children had been caught stealing food from the other kids at school because they were so hungry. That year, the PSF was working with Jamie and Sarah again after a report that the children had severe and chronic cases of head lice. Kylie was not allowed to return to school until the issue was resolved. Instead of Sarah caring about her daughter's education, she ignored the bugs and just didn't send Kylie back. Therefore, poor Kylie needed to repeat kindergarten the following year. On November 2, 2010, Jamie and Sarah were once again being investigated by the DCF, this time for a cigarette burn or a cigarette lighter burn that his teacher noticed on the side of his neck. Good old PSF stepping in again to attempt to get this family back on track. This is where I would have to truly stop and consider the danger that these children were in. Burning a child, or a child just becoming burned by themselves due to neglect and a lack of supervision, is a huge issue. I've seen kids get removed from homes for way less, yet the children are still there. One issue was that different caseworkers would be responding to these incidents over the years. The DCF would explain that the agency would view things as a snapshot, like, this is a snapshot of what this family is like, rather than a movie. So if you're looking at all the ins and outs and all the characters that are at play, you can see the big picture. But if you're just looking at a snapshot, you really don't know what's going on. Essentially, they were not putting two and two together, even though children's lives were at stake here. The times that Sarah and Jamie were the caregivers and the caseworkers were investigating them, they wouldn't do enough research into Don's past. Let's say he's a convicted felon with a checkered past. So when they wouldn't volunteer to get help, Sarah and Jamie would turn to Don as a support system. He was the one that, remember, I said signs off as a third party. The police, EMTs, and the school resource officers in Bell were familiar with the Spirit family. Yet none of these reports seemed to come together and paint the horrific picture of this family's grim reality. Without enough money to afford the drugs they were used to acquiring, Jaime started to buy synthetic marijuana for him and Sarah. I had heard about synthetic marijuana back in the day, probably around the same time it was a popular alternative. Plus, it was legal then, but it's not legal now, at least not in Florida. I never knew what it was or why anyone would want to use a synthetic drug like that when they could just get the real thing. But it turns out it's cheaper, easier to get, and it gets you just as high, if not higher. It's shredded plant materials that are sprayed with a chemical similar to chemicals found in marijuana, but it's not the same. In fact, it's not safe and may affect the brain much more powerfully than marijuana. The effects can be unpredictable and in some cases more dangerous or even life-threatening. These synthetic drugs are psychoactive and affect how the brain works. They can change your mood, your awareness, thoughts, feelings, and your behavior. I also read somewhere that they can be up to 100 times more potent than THC. It's a drug that you may have never heard of, but it is raising serious safety concerns in communities across the nation.
It's a drug that you may have never heard
unheard of, but it is raising serious safety concerns in communities across the nation. Take a look at this video just in, showing a man high on synthetic marijuana, according to law enforcement. Now, police say that this drug is partly responsible for a spike in violent crime.
What made them popular to Sarah was that you could get them in smoke shops, novelty stores, and even gas stations. You can buy them over the internet as well. They also come in flashy packaging that can look cool to kids, making it more enticing or seem fun. Its street name is Spice. The specific brand of spice that Sarah and Jamie liked to buy was called K2. Users have reported symptoms of psychosis, delusional or disordered thinking, and detachment from reality. They have psychotic effects as well, which could include extreme anxiety, confusion, paranoia, and extreme and unreasonable distrust of others, hallucinations, sensations, and images that seem real but are not really there. I bet you know where I'm going with this. It's important to keep all of these things in mind as you hear about what happens just a few years after the Spirit family begins their journey into making spice a normal part of their lives. This spice is not the spice of life. It's actually one of the catalysts of death. As a matter of fact, Sarah called 911 a few months after starting to smoke spice. She and Jamie were having some kind of bad reaction, and paramedic Devin Taylor came out to Jamie and Sarah's place to check on them. He took their vital signs, made sure they were okay, and then just went on his way. Sarah was warned of the dangers and not to have it around her children, but that did not stop her. The next 3 years were some of the worst for this family, as though they hadn't been through enough already. In 2011, while Sarah was living with Jamie, Dawn took her to court, claiming that she was taking child support payments she wasn't supposed to because he had been watching her son, Jonathan. Dawn said he was supposed to be getting those payments. Surprisingly, the judge sided with Dawn on this one. Sarah was ordered to pay him $6,578 in back payments, so you could see how much she was getting from these support payments. That's a lot of money. I just wonder how many months that was, but that's a lot. So now she's supposed to be paying Dawn $100 a month to clear this up. I was thinking, how was she supposed to get this money? I guess she could give him any other support payments that she was getting that were coming in. But then, how would she fund her addiction? Interestingly, by the way, anytime the children were at Dawn's or Christine's, their paternal grandparents' homes, wherever they were, the public assistance payments wouldn't be made out to Sarah anymore. They would be made out to whoever the children were with at the time. So some have argued that the children were tossed around and taken in by certain family members because those family members wanted the money, and not necessarily out of the kindness of their hearts. On January 21st, 2012, there was a call to the DCF, but when they went out to screen the family, they didn't find anything that would warrant further investigation, so they just dropped the case. There must have been something going on because a month later, on February 28th, the DCF was back at Jamie and Sarah's. Caleb had sliced open his foot on a piece of glass. No idea how this happened or where, but he was sent to school like that, without any treatment being done by his parents. When his teacher noticed how deep this cut was, she immediately sent him to the school nurse. The nurse was pretty shocked, so she phoned Sarah right away and told her, "You need to get him looked at by a doctor. Like now." Instead, when Caleb came home from school, she didn't take him to the doctor. She dunked his foot in a tub of bleach, put toilet paper around his wound, and duct taped it. I know how bad hydrogen peroxide is, but bleach? Caleb came to school once again, and the nurse didn't know what to do, so she called the school resource officer. His name is David Adelholtz, and he decided to bring Caleb to the doctor. The doctor provided Adelholtz with all the instructions on how to clean the wound, and he relayed all of this to Sarah. But instead of doing what she was supposed to do to help him, she was back on drugs and not paying any attention to any of the children. Because Sarah wasn't supervising the children, they ended up leaving the residence and were picked up by neighbors. The neighbors brought them straight to the police station, and you'd think someone was going to get arrested or charged. No charges were brought against them. They just got the children and brought them right back. This time, though, The pure lack of follow-through on cleaning and caring for Caleb's foot, which was now showing signs of infection, finally pushed the DCF caseworkers to finally threaten legal action against her if she didn't start being more responsible. But you see, threats are not actions, mostly because instead of removing the children, they would believe Sarah's promises and just allow her to refuse services again and again, providing no supervision to protect these children. For the next 8 months, the PSF and the DCF provided the family with in-house services, once again hoping that they could educate and assist Sarah to become a better caregiver. She would engage in the services here and there. The case finally closed once again in September of 2012, when Sarah refused help once again. She explained that the drugs were not the problem. It was her epilepsy. She wasn't herself lately, according to her, because she had had seizures and was suffering from stress and anxiety attacks. Still, she refused to get help, and there were no medical records indicating she had epilepsy. It was most likely the spice that was making her feel that way. She also told caseworkers that she was in and out of hospitals due to only having one kidney, and that she suffered from chronic pain because of what she called a birth defect. In addition to that, she had self-reported that she was diagnosed with pelvic inflammatory disease. Again, nothing on her medical records could be found, not even any mental health records. Chances are she never went to get help. She probably didn't think she needed help, considering she kept refusing help. Oddly, when I'm reading these DCF reports, and I might be reading them wrong, but recall there were witnesses to the wound on Caleb's foot. A doctor, a school nurse, the school resource officer, teachers. Yet the DCF report states their findings as follows: not substantiated findings of medical neglect to Caleb and no indications of inadequate supervision to Caleb, Kylie, Jonathan, Destiny, and Brandon. Really? Are they investigating the right family? The final report regarding Caleb's foot read, needs are being seen to with the help of others. What others? The teacher and the resource officer. Is it their responsibility, or was it done because, in that case, it's like the helpless being led by the clueless? As they would say, the inmates are running the asylum. Neighbors knew, paramedics knew, school counselors knew, school resource officers knew, yet no one was doing a thing about it. They're just hoping for the best with minimal voluntary services. It wasn't long before the DCF was back, just a few months later, in January 2013, when Brandon fractured his arm. While he was being examined at the hospital, the x-rays showed Brandon's arm had already been fractured once before, and it wasn't done healing yet. This was a compound fracture, a second fracture to the same arm. I think I could probably guess why his arm was broken, but I'll let you decide what you think happened. Sarah and Jamie were questioned about what happened to Brandon regarding both fractures, and their stories were not consistent with the damage. They blamed it on Dawn. He was the one outside with Brandon when his arm was injured. A child protection team medical director was now on the case, and because Dawn was blamed, they recommended, there's that word, recommended, can you guess? Voluntary in-home services. No arrests, no removal of the children. What is this? We're not just dealing with a broken arm, we are dealing with a broken system. There's no doubt Sarah did the same thing that she's always done. She minimally participated in the assistance programs, kept abusing drugs, and this resulted in yet another call to DCF in May of 2013, and this was from Jamie's grandmother. So the children's great-grandmother is now calling into the DCF. She tells them that both Destiny and Brandon's teeth are falling out, that they're completely rotten. There was a child protection team from the University of Florida on the case. This time, the University of Florida Child Protection Team, CPT, advised the DCF on what steps they needed to take. Christine had now called the authorities, trying to protect her grandchildren. She told one of the deputies, Don is bipolar, he's not taking his meds, and he's abusing spice. They came in and conducted forensic interviews with all the children. Several of the children expressed fear of Don. When Sarah was interviewed, she told them she had seen guns in the home that belonged to Don, who, as a convicted felon, was not allowed to have them. The kids said that Jamie would completely wreck the house looking for K2, and if he couldn't find it, he would turn everything over in the entire house. This was heartbreaking. The kids also said, Mom and Dad are drug addicts. For them to even know, understand, and realize that that's what's going on with their parents, it hurt deeply. In the final report, the University of Florida CPT recommended, there's that word again, that Don have no unsupervised contact with his grandchildren, and that Sarah should take classes to become a better parent. They also interviewed people at the school, finding out that Kylie was really struggling. She had to be held back due to chronic lice infestations. The school was working diligently with Caleb, Kylie, and Jonathan, one-on-one, to address the gaps in their academic progress due to excessive absences. But that would soon end, and not for a good reason. The agency administrators had a meeting to decide whether to remove Sarah's children or force her to accept supervision and help from the state. The conclusion in the report read, it was determined there was no reason to seek judicial intervention for compulsory services or ultimately removal from the mother's care because the children were not in imminent danger. In July, just 2 months later, Sarah had failed the Better Parenting program. Ironically, she was about to become a parent for the 6th time. That's right. In September 2013, Sarah found out she was pregnant with her 6th child. By the next month, in November, Jamie was in court on a theft charge for attempting to pawn stolen property. He was put on probation until his sentencing hearing, which would be sometime the next year. Sarah and Jamie must have been desperate, because Sarah got caught stealing a vehicle. She was convicted of grand theft and put on 18 months of probation. Just probation with the criminal record she has. Do these agencies even talk to one another? Do they share these reports? Now Sarah and Jamie are using drugs again while they're on probation. On February 13th, 2013, the day before Valentine's Day, another child had a burn. The school nurse notified DCF, explaining that the burn would have been much better if it had been treated the night before. I think Sarah just wanted to be left alone to do her own thing, so she tried to get Destiny to go to bed, even if she wasn't tired yet. The DCF report stated not substantiated findings of inadequate supervision, therefore no ongoing services were needed. Not needed? I'll tell you what I believe is not needed. All these people and agencies coming in and out of the children's lives who didn't do any good. It's unnecessary to keep sending in people who aren't thoroughly putting the pieces together, who can't even see through the fake smiles and artificial charm, and who were themselves negligent and failed these children. Who is supposed to protect these kids from their own parents? Whose responsibility is it? I was thinking those were the questions that kept me from finishing this research. I kept wondering, when a children's caregiver can't be trusted, who is supposed to step in? The grandparents? What if they can't help? Then who? The state. If it's the state, who are the individuals hired for such a huge responsibility? They're making decisions that can mean life or death. Well, we find out that they weren't the right people in this case, not at all. Dropping the ball is an understatement. You can tell me at the end why you think the DCF and PSF failed here, but let's move on. I feel like a literal broken record because no other case I've ever done includes this much neglect from so many people. But once again, an incident report in June of 2013 shows the presence of drugs and guns within the home, including filthy living conditions. Let's look at this graphic together. They get a call, that's the first step. And to their credit, it seems the teachers, who hardly get enough recognition for the jobs that they do, were the only ones, besides the neighbors, who probably only called in out of annoyance, that would go out of their way to call and make these reports to the DCF. And I'm thinking, why aren't they calling the police? This graphic here says Florida Child Welfare System, a roadmap to protecting our most vulnerable. Well, it might be a roadmap, but to me, it seems like a damn dead end. A phone call, then an investigation to determine whether these allegations are verified, and I would love to see what standard the caseworkers were using at this time to decide whether the allegations were not substantiated or that there were no indications of harm. Those are the two conclusions that don't warrant support, and if you don't pass go, none of the other options around this bend in the roadmap even get triggered. A court case was never opened. The furthest Sarah's cases ever got were to the protective supervision, and there were only 2 or 3 that even reached that far. Though right here, these 2 words, safe or unsafe, Why is that determined after a court case is opened? It seems backwards. Sarah failed a number of times, so why was there no case plan put into action? No safe harbor, no foster homes, nothing. Again, they closed the case. Sorry, not sorry that I'm explaining all this because it matters. This is the children's story. This is giving them a voice, and those happy cartoon children upset me when I'm looking at this graphic, honestly. But then again, something really bothered me and confused me because I'm a very observant person. I'm very detail-oriented. I've even read enough cases to spot issues, or so I thought, because I was looking at these photos. And to me, it's true. The children look happy. They look like they're dressed in nice outfits. Caleb played baseball on a team. He obviously had to make it to the practice, make it to the games. That's a big responsibility. Kylie wore beautiful dresses to church. Sarah took cute pictures with her kids. They're in car seats, which obviously means someone was being responsible because that's the best thing to do. They went on trips to carnivals, riding carousels, on a trip to the beach at night. I think Sarah loved her kids. I believe that there was definitely love in her heart, but not in her actions. Who was taking Caleb to baseball, buying the children nice clothes? Who was doing that? Because from the outside looking in, they look like they're living a pretty normal life. One of Sarah's friends said she had a good heart, but was always struggling to keep her life and her children's lives in one piece. She had no job. She couldn't work with all them kids. Every time I turned around, something bad was happening to her. I see what her friend is saying. Sarah lost everyone. Her brother Kyle at a young age. Her dad went to prison. Her brother Josh was locked up, and soon, both of her children's fathers would be too. When the DCF said the kids were getting care from others, I have to assume it was Christine or the other grandparents. The pictures of Sarah smiling with her kids, it gives me that she's a good mom vibe. Even I'm not seeing the signs, but I wasn't standing in her home knowing all the calls with the allegations supporting them. What has to go on in a home in Florida? Is it death? I guess so. And how many deaths? Sadly, we are about to find out. We're getting closer and closer to the end. Jamie hasn't been sentenced yet. It's now July 24th, 2014. Just a month ago, on June 22nd, Sarah gave birth to her 6th child, Alana. They now have 6 children under the age of 12. 4 of the children are attending Bell Elementary School. When they're at school, it's probably the only time they're treated like human beings, the only place they're truly safe, around people who actually care about them. School, their safe haven. It's a wonder they even made it to school with 2 parents whose driver's licenses are suspended, and obviously without a vehicle, since we know Sarah tried to steal one. Luckily, they did take the bus. I don't even know how they got to the bus stop in the mornings, but maybe Sarah was still up from the night before doing spice. It is crazy how much people can hide. As they say, you never know what's going on behind closed doors. Unfortunately, the children didn't have their safe haven because they were not in school in July. They were out on summer break with no one to supervise them. The DCF gets a call that all 6 children, including the newborn, were left alone, unsupervised, in Jamie and Sarah's dilapidated shack on his family's property. And where were Jamie and Sarah? They were out looking for more K2. They were now using it on a daily basis. 5-year-old Destiny was reportedly injured while home alone, and one of the kids ran to a neighbor's house to ask for help. The neighbor got a hold of a family member who, according to them, called the DCF. Sarah had been using spice for years, but now it was much more than a recreational drug. It was like a food, a necessity. The way she would feel when she was coming off of it was just too much to handle. People who knew the family said that Sarah acted like the children weren't even there. If she needed to go somewhere and leave the house, she wouldn't even make plans for anyone to care for the children. She would just walk out the door. Caleb was 11 at the time, so I'm sure he took on a lot of the responsibility for his younger siblings, especially his precious newborn sister, Alana. Sarah was arrested on August 26th for violating her probation. Earlier, she had actually $400 from a friend's wallet. Then her probation officer went to give her a drug test, and she failed it. There's a probationary period until sentencing, so she's released. This report was closed 2 days later, on August 28th. One of the investigators, Shelley McDoris, made a final conclusion that the allegations were unfounded. They were just a false report made by that family member because they had a fight with Sarah. According to Sarah, they were just trying to retaliate against her, and Shelley signed off that all the children's needs were being met. The report further went on to state, and you can read it here for yourself, no indicators of inadequate supervision. How would you know if the children are there when you come over? How is that evidence that they weren't alone? Earlier it says no indicators of substance misuse. Again, how do you know if you're not there when it's happening? How do you know no misuse of illicit drugs? No indicators of physical injury to Destiny. Maybe there weren't any outward signs of injury, but what about mental abuse, psychological, verbal? Do those count? Because I think they should. However, another DCF investigator, Sandra Hodge, tried to explain in her report that this was not a false report. Sarah had admitted to using K2 a couple of weeks ago back in July during the case that had just closed. Remember, a year before she also admitted to it. She said, "Oh, it's not the drugs, it's my medical issues." So they knew. But investigator Hodge went on to note that when she observed the children, they were well-groomed, dressed appropriately for school, and excited to get off the bus and be home with their mom. Luckily, the children were back in school in August when all of this was going on, so at the very least, they got away from these parents during the week. But they were about to get away from Jamie for good. He was finally sentenced in August. This may seem like a good thing, but it's not. It left Sarah with no help. Not that Jamie was that much help, but it was 2 extra hands at least, and now she has no job, no place to stay, and 6 children. She was again knocking on the doors of neighbors' homes, asking for diapers and food for Alana. Of course, the cycle begins once again. The neighbors call the DCF, and yet another case is opened on September 1st. Sadly, this would be the last case, but not for any good reasons. By that time, Sarah was back at Dawn's. She was forced to move back in with him, the man that the University of Florida Child Protection Team recommended the children not have any unsupervised contact with. Not only were Sarah and the 6 kids living at Dawn's in his single-wide trailer, but Colleen's daughter, Katie, was living there too. And guess what? Katie was only 17, and she had a child of her own that was living there as well. Her name was Sophia. She was just under 2 years old, born in March 2013. There were 9 people that we know of living in this small trailer, and Colleen would be over all the time as well. The call on September 1st came after a family member reported that Sarah and Dawn were smoking K2 in front of the children and leaving them unattended. Big surprise. How many reports do you think there had been? By this time, there had been over 18 investigated incidents involving the DCF. 18. 12 years of reports just involving Sarah and her kids, not including all the years that Dawn was the alleged perpetrator in other child welfare incidents. On September 2nd, the Gilchrist County Sheriff's Office did a welfare check at Dawn's home and concluded the children were not in danger. Their police report indicated that they were very familiar with the Spirit family, which may have affected the way these cases were handled. The fact that the family was well known to everyone, from the residents to law enforcement, the school system, DCF, and PSF, may have led them to see this family's reports as the boy who cried wolf, like people were just calling in, and there really was nothing wrong. Or was it the same old thing? So much so that they would merely check off a box that it was just another false alarm. No one had died yet, right? So, what's there to worry about? Past precedent shows that nothing major has ever happened, so why would you assume it would, right? Wrong. Again, the agencies thought they knew and understood the family dynamics at play. Essentially, these caseworkers became conditioned to the pattern, so much so that they thought they could predict the future, as if convicted felons on drugs are predictable. Sarah told the DCF investigators she had been released from jail after violating her probation and testing positive for illegal substances. She tells them that the case was open and still being investigated when tragedy struck just 2 weeks later. Don seemed to be on edge. He was much angrier than usual. This may have been a result of the spice. He was stressed out over money. Everyone was staying in his trailer. He didn't get along with Colleen. Don most likely resented Colleen's nephew Jamie, who never truly stepped up for his kids. Don probably thought that Jamie should have been doing more, but that's the pot calling the kettle black. You're about to find out just how much he hated the Stewart family. Maybe he blamed Jamie for getting Sarah hooked on K2 and then in turn, hating the fact that he was now smoking it too. We will never know the thoughts that were going on in Don's head. What we do know is he's getting upset over phone calls that are coming into his cell phone. Sarah didn't have a phone of her own, so she was using Don's. He was getting texts from people as well as answering phone calls. We also know that Katie decided to move out of the trailer just a week before the tragedy that occurred on Thursday, September 18th. Katie couldn't take it anymore. There were a variety of factors, but what pushed her over the edge was Don's escalating anger. She told people that Don was yelling and cussing way too much. He was also off his medication. That's when it seemed like he started becoming enraged. He said he wasn't going to be taking his medicine anymore because it wasn't helping him, and it never had. It's really common for individuals struggling with disorders to believe they're better off without their medication. When they're on the medication, they feel balanced, or they're balanced without knowing it. So this gives them a false sense of reality of what it would be like if they were off their meds. He said, "The medicine I've tried, it ain't working. The one medicine I have is my family." I guess that medication didn't work for Don either. One of the issues causing Don to become angry was that as soon as Colleen came back into the picture, Sarah began making even worse choices, one of which was to start providing men with sexual favors in exchange for money. Don believed this was Colleen's idea. Since we only know what Don said, we have no choice but to believe it, and it is safe to assume he knew more than we did. Calls started coming in either requesting sex or from the man that was helping Sarah get jobs. His name was Jose, and Colleen had introduced him to Sarah. A lot of times, women who will recruit other women into these sex trades get a cut of the money as well, or at least they get a lump sum for bringing in another woman, and that might have been what was going on here. Either way, Don believed Colleen was turning Sarah into a usor, his words. Sarah owed her dad money. She was ordered to pay him $100 a month. Plus, I'm sure she needed money for her K2 as well as other necessities. In order to get that money, she started selling her body. All we know about Jose is that he was a Hispanic man from Trenton, Florida. Sarah had only known him for a couple of days. On Tuesday, September 16th, Jose actually shows up at Don's trailer to pick up Sarah. I'm sure Don was there. He didn't work. He was probably helping Sarah watch the kids. Or Sarah could have left all the kids alone, and then maybe Don came home and discovered that. We don't know, but Don knew what Sarah was doing because of the phone. At that time, Sarah only came home with $25. The next day, on Wednesday, September 17th, Colleen was over Don's the entire day. She said that Don was livid, and at one point, Colleen heard him telling Sarah that, quote, "Your kids aren't worth a go. Tell someone to come get them because I don't love them. I hate them." Just a short time later, Don apologized to Sarah for making those comments. He said he was just really stressed. Again, Jose reached out, and this time, on the second occasion, Sarah told him to meet her at the dollar store in Bell, probably because she knew Don was going to freak out. When Sarah came back, she had $70 this time. No one knows what went on the rest of the night, what conversations, arguments, or words were exchanged, but what we know is that all four of Sarah's older children, Caleb, Kylie, Destiny, and Jonathan, got on the bus and made it to Bell Elementary School on Thursday morning. We can assume that Sarah was most likely at home that day with Dawn and the two younger kids, Brandon and Alana. The older kids were set to get off the bus just after 3 p.m., and the school is only about 7 minutes from Dawn's. Caleb was old enough to walk them to and from the bus stop to the trailer. No one would come and get them off the bus or be waiting for them when they returned from school, although sometimes Dawn would stand outside the house and yell at the kids in the morning as they were walking to the bus. Neighbors heard this a number of times. They even described him as hating his grandchildren. That Thursday, September 18th, was different. Dawn was waiting for the kids at the bus stop, When they saw him, they were afraid to get off. Don was known to take bike rides along his street as well as through town. The whole family had suspended licenses, so he rode his bike everywhere he went. That day, around 3:30 p.m., a neighbor named Tate Bryant, who lived at 2870 Northwest 29th Terrace, was home all day. He saw Don walking down the street, which seemed unusual since he only saw Don ride his bike and never walking. He walked up and down the street 3 times as though he was looking for someone or something. He could tell that Don's body was tensed up. His body language gave off the impression that he was really angry. Brian didn't observe anything else. Don's trailer is the smaller circle, and Mr. Bryant lives at the bigger one. It's about a 6-minute walk. I looked up the school bus route. The bus would stop at the end of 29th Terrace at Northwest 30th Street. A neighbor named Victoria Edwards, who we're going to hear from in just a moment because I'm going to play something that she said, lives at 2759 Northwest 29th Terrace. She said she saw Don walking to the end of 29th Terrace toward 30th Street to pick the kids up from the bus stop. She echoed what the other neighbor said. She had never seen Don walk the kids back from the bus stop. It takes approximately 9 minutes to walk from the bus stop to Don's trailer. So, putting the timeline together, I'm going to assume Don walked the kids inside, then came back out and was walking down the road, seemingly looking for someone or something. Now this is my theory. I think he was looking for Jose. The last 2 days, Sarah had gone somewhere with Jose. He even came to the trailer to pick Sarah up, and Don was not happy about it. I think Don wanted to have some words with Jose and scare him away because he knew Sarah did not have the willpower to stop. She was going to continue since she was so desperate, and this was quick and easy money. Don may have thought that if Jose knew that Don could possibly hurt him or even kill him, because Don does have guns, according to Sarah, Jose would back off. I think he had his gun on him. Again, this is my theory, but I'm considering this because of how fast things escalated when he got home. I'm assuming he was armed, expecting to come into contact with Jose. The reason I say this is because neighbors Betty and Billy Dyer, who lived at 2720 Northwest 29th Terrace, were coming back home around 3:45 from picking up their granddaughter at school. This timeline matches up with Mr. Bryant's. The couple and their granddaughter were driving south on the roadway and saw a dark-skinned male in his 30s walking down Northwest 29th Terrace, the road in front of Don's trailer. He was just past the neighbor's residence to the north, so he was walking towards Don's. You can see on the map here that the top circle is the Dyers and the bottom one is Don's. But get this, they described him as Hispanic, with dark, medium-length wavy hair and a thin mustache. He had a medium build, and he was fit, so we know this isn't Don. That's not Don's body type. Plus, all the neighbors knew Don. This wasn't Don. The Dyer did not know who this person was. He was not a familiar face. As they looked his way, he was staring back at them in a weird way as they drove by. He actually continued to stare at them, just looking back at them as they drove. I think Don saw a text or got a call from Jose, and he knew that Jose was on his way. Who knows, maybe he actually made contact with Jose? We don't know. But what we do know for sure is that by 4 p.m., Don was on the phone with a 911 operator. Listener discretion is advised right now. This is going to be hard for some of you to hear. I'm going to play it.
County 911, what's the address of the emergency?
Yes, ma'am. I just shot my daughter and shot all my grandkids, and I'll be sitting on my step, and then when you get here, I'm going to shoot myself.
What is the address that you're at, sir?
2550 Northwest, 25 Terrace, downstairs. Every one of them are dead.
You said your name is Don Spirit?
Yep.
All right, Don, what kind of gun do you have?
It doesn't matter what kind of gun I got. They're all dead, and then when you get here, I'll shoot myself, and then you figure out what kind of gun it is.
And how long did this happen, Don?
I don't want to hear it, man. I'm done with every fucking thing. Just bring the motherfuckers out here, that's all. You got all the kids are dead in the house.
Okay, how many people? Okay, how many people?
6 kids, 1 adult.
6 kids and 1 adult?
Yeah. One of them is a baby.
All right, Don. Is there any way you can stay on the phone with me till I get somebody there to help you?
What's that?
Can I have you stay on the phone with me?
No, not that. I'm waiting for them to get here. When they get here, I'm going to shoot myself on my back step. All I'm doing is waiting for them.
So you're sitting on your back steps?
Yep.
Okay, Don.
Wait before you leave or think everything is over. Stay. I'm going to walk you through this crime scene. Everything I have is from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement investigative reports.
And right now, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement investigators are combing through the scene looking for clues as to the sequence of events that led up to this murder.
The sheriff says a deputy arrived after Don Spirit called emergency services to say he might harm himself and others.
To me, I actually truly think he wanted police to come as quickly as possible so that his family's bodies were not found by someone that cared about him or left there to rot. You might disagree with me, that's okay, but I think he did care about his family in some sick way. He just wasn't right in the head. Remember Resource Officer David Adderholt, who took Caleb to the doctor first? Well, sadly, he was the very first person on the scene. Adderholt was near the school when he heard dispatch send a call out. It was a call regarding a person who killed 6 kids and his daughter and would kill himself. Adderholt said he was so familiar with Don and the family and the residents that he just knew. So he rushed over, parked his car on the road outside the trailer, and he could see Don walking near the back portion of the trailer, which is where the entryway was. The front door was broken and it was permanently sealed. Don was just pacing back and forth, and it didn't look like there were any weapons on him at the time. Adderholt called out to Don by name over his patrol car speaker and identified himself. He told Don to please show him his hands, and Don complied. He put his hands up. Don was cursing, telling the officer he wasn't going to hurt him. And Adderholt wasn't scared of Don at that point, at least not enough to stay covered, because he came out from behind his cruiser so that Don could see him. He wanted to show him he was someone Don knew. After all, this was the officer who took care of his own grandchild a number of times. While Adderholt was speaking with Don, K-9 Deputy Scott Douglas arrived on the scene with lights and sirens. He parked behind Adderholt, pulled out his AR, and met him behind the patrol car for cover. Douglas also knew Don, and he listened while Adderholt was trying to convince Don to come talk to them. Don began walking closer to the vehicle, and Adderholt once again told him to show him his hands, which he did. Then Don said, "I'm not mad at you. This is significant, so listen." Don told Adderholt, "I am not mad at you. I'm mad at the Stewarts. Colleen Stewart has turned Sarah into drugs, and I'm fed up with this whole family. The Stewart family has ruined my family, they've ruined my life, and I'm tired of them all, and I've taken care of it today." It's a heavy statement, it's a really important one, and it's very telling. Once again, Adderholt asked Don to come to the roadside, but Don just responded with, "I killed them all." Adderholt asked, "Who?" Don replied, "Danielle's the kids inside. I killed the kids inside. They're in the trailer dead, and Sarah's dead too." Adderholt where Sarah was, and Don pointed to a tarp on the front lawn close by the driveway. While he was pointing, he screamed something to the effect of, "She's under that right there." Douglas overheard Adderholt tell Don he didn't feel safe with Don near the truck. Don insisted he wasn't there to harm them. He told them he was going to come down to the road. Adderholt asked Don where the weapon was, and he said it was inside. Adderholt knew if that were true, then Don would have to make his way back to the back of the trailer to go get it, so he wanted to keep Don coming forward toward them. Both officers saw Don starting to walk near the back of the trailer, but he stopped and picked up a jug of water, then made his way back to the driveway near his white truck. At that point, when Adderholt attempted to talk to Don, he was way less responsive. Another officer was driving up at this time. They don't know if Don saw these additional officers and started getting scared. Gilchrist County Sheriff Deputy Brittany Lee was the third to respond on the scene. She parked behind the two other cars and made her way behind Douglas's cruiser with her medical kit, her AED, and a patrol rifle. She had Don right in her line of sight, but from where she was standing, she could only see him from the waist up, and it did not seem like he had a weapon in his hand. She reached down, turned the safety off on her rifle, and was ready to fire. Other officers arrived close to the time that Officer Lee arrived. It was Lieutenant Edwin Jenkins, Sergeant Stephen Stalvey, and Sheriff Robert Dale Schultz III. They were right next to Adderholt, trying to formulate a plan as Don walked to the back of his property. Stalvey positioned himself with his rifle ready along the fence line and had binoculars on and could see Don but not a weapon at this point. Officer Lee was about to raise her weapon and pointed in Don's direction. This is when Adderholt watched Don as Don walked back from behind the trailer, returned into view before Officer Lee could take aim, and before Adderholt could say anything to him, a gunshot rang out. There was no echo, it was just a thud. Adderholt shouted that Don had shot himself. Adderholt radioed to dispatch that Don had shot himself and that they needed medical units right away. Sergeant Stephen Stalvey, Lieutenant Jenkins, Lieutenant Jeff Manning, and Officer Douglas formed a line to make their way to the trailer and secure the scene. As he got closer, Deputy Douglas noticed Don was lying on the ground. A wooden-handled .45 caliber handgun was lying at his feet. Crime scene investigator Michelle Jones, now on the scene, is picking up the corner of the tarp next to the driveway, and she asks Adderholt to positively identify the body of Sarah Spirit. He looks underneath and verifies. After this, Adderholt turned around and left the scene, as close as he was to those children. I don't think he could have stomached walking into that crime scene. As they approached Don, Deputy Lee checked for a pulse but found none. He was 51 years old and pronounced dead. Deputy Douglas was the first to walk the crime scene. Right behind him was EMS worker Devin Taylor. Taylor was walking to the scene to check vitals, render aid, or pronounce the victim deceased. Recall that Taylor was... I wanted to talk about the directionality of each of these wounds, but unfortunately I don't think I'm going to be able to go into that detail. Just know that this was a very horrific crime scene. If you want to use your own imagination, I'm sure you can come up with a mental picture. She was just inside the doorway. The little girl was identified as Kylie Marie Coleman, 9 years old. Taylor pronounced her dead, and they made their way down the hall. This is not Don's real trailer, but I found this floor plan and wanted to show it so that you can see what a trailer like this looked like, and also how they made their way through and where they found everyone. Only a few feet away, they found the body of a preteen boy. He was dressed in a short-sleeved shirt, shorts, and sneakers. He was pronounced dead and identified as Caleb Coleman, 11 years old. They made their way into the main portion of the trailer, which was the living area. The trailer was a mess. It was in complete disarray. Despite the usual mess, there were signs of a struggle. They could see into the kitchen since it was sort of all one room, and the refrigerator was lying on its side. It takes a lot of force to push over a refrigerator. Sergeant Stalvey made his way to the couch. It was obvious to them that she showed no signs of life. This was 10-week-old Alana Stewart, so sick and so heartbreaking. Special Agent Watts and Deputy Lee were leading the officers into the north bedroom. When they entered, they saw the body of a little girl on a futon. She was identified as Destiny Stewart, just 5 years old. Next to her at the foot of the futon was the body of a young boy, and Deputy Lee remarked that it appeared he was trying to hide. This poor boy was trying to hide in plain sight because there was nowhere for him to go. He was identified as Brandon Stewart, only 4 years old, a sweet little baby boy. Why would anyone do that? Sergeant Stalvey walked to the other end of the trailer and entered the south bedroom. Lying on the floor, right in the doorway, was the body of Jonathan Coleman, 8 years old. It was apparent to Sergeant Stalvey, as well as all the other personnel on scene, that no one had survived their injuries. They exited the trailer and deemed it safe and secure for forensics to proceed. When Deputy Lee exited, she was asked by Lieutenant Jenkins to check under the tarp and verify the identity and vitals of the victim. Lee removed the tarp, revealing Sarah's spirit lying on her stomach. Lee placed the tarp back over Sarah as they made their way back to the patrol cars. Oh, this part, I hate this part. As they made their way back to the patrol cars, Special Agent Watts and Sheriff Schultz saw Sarah's mother, Christine. She was outside on the roadway in front of the trailer. At that time, they had the unbelievably difficult task of informing her about the death of an entire family. I actually can't imagine. I was trying to imagine it. I don't want to imagine it, but the horror, sadness, disbelief, and emotional wreck that Christine must have been in, it must have been overwhelming. Police said that because of her emotional state, she could not give them much information. All she could say was that Don was bipolar, and to her knowledge, he was using illegal narcotics. She hadn't spoken to Sarah since last week, but knew that Sarah was living with Don just until she could save enough money to rent a place of her own. I have so many mixed emotions, and when I read this, my heart ached for Christine, but it also ached for Sarah. Those last moments, knowing full well you are never going to see your babies again. It wasn't a quick death, and I'll tell you why in just a moment, because I have the autopsy reports. As much as I want to hate Sarah, I still want to cry for her. Just reading the part about Christine saying that she knew Sarah was just trying to save money so she could rent her own place. It just hurt. And maybe she was just working for drugs, but a part of me truly believes that she was hoping that somehow she could pull herself out of this mess. When this small town heard about what happened, you could have guessed it tore the residents apart.
We received a call around 4 o'clock this afternoon. I haven't handled something like this at all. And to say that this county, this community, was not going to be devastated from this, from a small county, we're all family here. And we don't need to lose focus. This isn't about the gentleman that did this. This is certainly about the poor children and memory of them. The poor children tomorrow morning when they go to school, how devastating that's going to be for them.
Grief counselors were sent to Bell Elementary and surrounding schools. The next night, on Friday, the victims were honored with a balloon release by the captains from Bell and Trenton High School before their big football game. The fans were asked to wear white in solidarity. A woman named Danielle Berry said that she grew up in Bell and went home early from work so she could wear something white and show her support. She said, "Never live for tomorrow because tomorrow isn't promised." A friend of Sarah's, named Casey Hart, was saddened by the loss and wanted everyone to know that Sarah was a busy mom who loved to laugh and watch comedies. She went on to say that Sarah's poor mother, Christine, had lost her youngest son, her oldest daughter, and all of her grandchildren. I found a picture because I like to look and know what these people look like. We see all the children, but I didn't know what Christine looked like, and I searched forever. I found her Facebook, and this is her with all her grandbabies before the tragedy. You can tell she just loved them so much. I mean, they're adorable, innocent kids. It's even hard for these grown men to talk about. Lieutenant Jeff Manning had a hard time containing his sadness during the second press conference that night.
I'm not real sure how you get clear signs that something like this could have happened. I mean, and... It's a difficult scene, okay? That's all I'll say.
I also wanted you to hear from some of the residents and what they had to say.
Neighbors in the rural area near Gainesville say they're devastated.
I think it's totally unnecessary. I mean, the kids didn't deserve this at all.
I was hoping nothing like this would happen.
I think everybody just needs to come together and, and start looking out for each other. Maybe, if they see somebody might needs help or something, maybe.
Remember I told you that Sarah didn't die a quick death? Her autopsy showed she was barefoot and had blunt force trauma to the back of her head. She may have been pistol whipped. There was a laceration on her head, as well as 6 stab wounds to her midsection. Remember that Don had pushed Sarah against the refrigerator once before. We can assume he did this again after becoming enraged over Josie. He probably had that anger still inside him, not able to let it out on Jose. He goes back inside, and he and Sarah most likely got into a fight. I just think things happened too fast. He comes inside, pushes her against the fridge, They fight, he grabs a knife and starts to stab her in the chest. She runs out the back door to go get help. She makes her way down to the front, and remember, her head when she falls is pointing towards the road. So, you know she was probably running toward the road, and that's when he shot her. She fell where she stood. Then he realized what he had done. Now Sarah was gone. Did he really intend to kill all of them that day? I don't think so. I don't think he premeditated this, but I think it hit him in that moment when he realized he had just killed his daughter. Now all those kids would be left without a mother, and he would be spending the rest of his life in prison or get death himself. The kids already had no fathers, and clearly Don hated the rest of the family, so he figured, I'm just going to end it, and he said he took care of it that day. Then I think he just turned back towards the door of the trailer. Kylie heard the commotion and probably went to check on her mom, and as she came through that door, he shot her. Then he just made his way all around that home, shooting each and every child one by one.
When investigators left the home of the father of 3 of the murdered children, family members could be seen supporting each other, one wearing a jersey with a baseball number of 11-year-old Caleb Coleman, a 5th grader at Bell Elementary. The back read Caleb's Papa. State investigators believe Donald Spirit murdered his daughter Sarah Spirit and all of her kids before killing himself because of a family dispute. The first Gilchrist County deputy arrived and saw an unarmed Spirit pacing in his backyard. The report says he told the deputy a relative of his daughter's boyfriend got her into prostitution and drugs. Spirit then said, quote, I'm fed up with this whole family. They have ruined my life and I'm tired of them all. And I've taken care of it today.
There are so many people who conclude that these murders happened just because Don was angry at Colleen. And that bothers me. Without knowing the whole story, that's just a part of what led up to these horrific deaths. Sarah had a choice. Don had a choice. Don killed these kids. It's Don's fault. You might be wondering why fathers, or in this case, grandfathers, kill their families and themselves. David Wilson of Birmingham City University actually divided this logic that these people have into 4 types: the anomic, disappointed, self-righteous, or paranoid. The anomic killer sees his family as a status symbol. When his economic status collapses, he sees them as a burden because now he has nothing. The disappointed killer seeks to punish his family for not living up to the ideals of what a family should be, in his perspective. The self-righteous killer destroys the family for revenge upon the mother. Finally, the paranoid killer kills their family because they imagine they are protecting them from something even worse. Which one do you think Don was? One last thing that I think you'll be happy to know is that the DCF had to pay a settlement for their inaction regarding these children. They actually conducted their own investigation first, deploying a critical incident response team to assess the nature and efficacy of the DCF's involvement. They wanted to evaluate potential systemic issues within the local system of care. I read all of it, and it was laughable, in my opinion. Some of the worst parts seemed to try to justify their inaction. Statements like this: there is no evidence to suggest that anyone at any time could have known that Don Spirit was capable of the premeditated and intentional massacre of his 6 grandchildren, his daughter, and then himself. They stated, there will never be one child who dies without DCF working to determine what changes can be made or processes improved to prevent further tragedy. Really? DCF administrators insisted that there was nothing in the 8-year history with the Spirit family that could have predicted this outcome. Oh, and this one was even worse. They showed a chart depicting only 4 deaths between 2009 and 2013. However, the Miami Herald was doing its own private investigation for years, digging through 6 years of DCF files and finding hundreds of children who died from abuse or neglect while working with the DCF. Sarah's children were added to the list of 534 children that had prior DCF history who will never get the chance to grow up. Without going into any more detail than I already have, the DCF and 2 private companies connected to it agreed to pay $750,000 to settle the legal claims that arose from Don's killing spree. DCF paid $450,000, Partnership for Strong Families paid $250,000, and DeVaro paid $50,000. The money went to the victims' estates. Some may conclude something good came out of these deaths, that changes were made to legislation and that more children will be protected because of this. I don't see it like that. I can't. None of these children had to die to protect others. Others should have protected them so they didn't have to die. Spring break. It's the time of year when the rules of our everyday routines don't matter, when we can leave behind the stresses of work and school and embrace the freedom of the moment. It's a time for adventure and excitement, for spontaneous road trips and lazy afternoons basking in the sun. That's exactly what Christine Lazaro was looking forward to on her spring break. What she didn't expect was that it would be her last adventure and she wouldn't be coming home alive. Let's get into Christine Lazaro. She was born on August 8, 1972, in Rochester, New York, to her mother Kathleen and her father Frank. She was the middle child of 3 children. She had an older brother, Frank III, named after his dad and grandpa. He was 2 years older than Christine, and she had a little sister, Daniel Lynn, who came 9 years later in 1981. Around 1984, the family moved to a quaint suburb of the city of Rochester called Irondequoit. I hope I'm saying that right, I'm trying here. The population was about 50,000 at the time. It's known to have big city culture but small city charm, and its name means where the land and the water meet. It does border Lake Ontario, just south of Toronto and Ottawa, Canada. Living in this part of New York, the summers are warm, but the winters are freezing, snowy, and windy, and it's partly cloudy all year long. Over the course of the year, the temperatures can vary from 18 degrees Fahrenheit to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's only warm from about June to August. Then, it's back to living in the cold. The snowy season there lasts for 5 months. When Christine, who by the way went by Chrissy, was just a kid, her parents actually split up. They got a divorce. It was hard on her and her family, but a thing about Chrissy is she was always looking on the bright side. She made the best of every situation, and she had always been a daddy's girl, especially after the divorce. Her dad would say that Chrissy was sugar and spice and everything nice. But of course, she was wearing jeans and a baseball cap. He was so proud of his little girl. Despite things not working out with her mom, Frank truly believed he had done everything right with Chrissy, and she was turning into an amazing young lady. He even wrote a poem about Chrissy as she was growing up, and this is what it said. Somewhere between a girl and a woman, this gift of God stands. She's a rose, a ray of sunshine, joy and laughter wrapped in lace or jeans, a treasure to hold, yet one to share. I was actually really touched by that. As a mom of a young girl myself, I feel like I could write something similar. Daughters can be such a joy to have in your life. Her dad also said that she had an excitement for life that was contagious. It must have been true because she attracted a lot of people her way. Chrissy was very popular among all types of groups of people growing up. She was very fun, and you'd know when she came into a room, mostly because of her looks first. She looked like she could be a model. She had long, wavy brown hair, a big smile, high cheekbones, and green eyes, but it was Chrissy's personality that made her even more beautiful. She was just fun. She had a goofy, silly side. You can tell in this photo, she's all dolled up with friends but making a funny face at the camera. Speaking of being dolled up, Chrissy had dreams of becoming a fashion designer. She was very stylish. She loved doing her hair, her makeup, picking out the perfect outfit, and her eye for detail and unique style made her stand out. She always wanted to make sure that everything was just right. She took pride in her appearance, and her dad encouraged her to go after what she was passionate about. So when it came time to choose a college, Chrissy's choice was to study fashion design at the local Monroe Community College, which was only 15 minutes away from where she lived. By 1993, she was 20 years old. She was going to school, and she was working part-time as a waitress at Galveston's Restaurant and Bar on East Ridge Road. It's right here, 2 minutes away from her house. Very convenient. It had opened in the fall, and Chrissy had been working there for 6 months since its grand opening. Chrissy was perfect for this job. She was very bubbly. She would jump from table to table, enthusiastically welcoming guests as they sat down and trying to make friends with each and every one. Tim Piccolo was her assistant manager at the time, and he'd say that the group of about 20 of them, the employees, they all loved Chrissy. They were like a big family, and she was a hard worker. She had a good reason to be. She was saving up to move into her own apartment, but she didn't plan to be alone. It was going to be a place that she would share with her very best friends, the three girls who knew Chrissy the best: Rita Filipponi, Lauren Marotti, and Kelly Pagoni. They were inseparable for many years. They did everything together. If you saw one of them, you saw all of them because they would go everywhere as a group. That's another thing Christine took pride in: being a good friend, a loyal friend, somebody you could always count on. For her, friends meant the world. I apologize, I accidentally referred to Chrissy as Christy. I know I did it several times throughout this video, and I am so sorry. It usually doesn't happen, but for some reason, Christine, Christy, Chrissy, it all kind of blended together for me in this video. So I am very sorry. I wanted to let you know I am aware of the mistake I made. I hope it does not distract you from this story. By early 1993, Chrissy had just started dating a guy named Carl Jeffries. He played minor league baseball, and she was pretty smitten. Her dad approved as well. He liked the way Carl was very gentlemanlike. He would open the doors for his daughter, and he was very well-mannered, and Frank really liked that about him. Not many guys still do that, by the way. I have one that still does, and I like being treated like a princess. Chivalry is definitely not wasted on me, and Chrissy felt the same. She enjoyed Carl's company, but they were just starting their romance. It wasn't serious just yet, especially since Carl wasn't around that much. He was very busy with his baseball career and spent most of his time in South Carolina practicing with his team, so they didn't really get to see much of each other. But when they both had spare time, they enjoyed spending it together. And that was okay because Chrissy was very busy herself, juggling college, work, and of course hanging out with the girls. They were planning a really fun trip to Florida for spring break. Their sunny destination, Daytona Beach, Florida. It's the perfect place to enjoy fun in the sun and so much more. Chrissy loved the beach, and she didn't get to go very often because, like I said, the closest one was probably about 300 miles away. So all she did was talk about this trip. She couldn't wait to get her toes in the sand and bake in the sun. She liked getting a nice bronze suntan, and Daytona is like paradise for someone living in colder weather. Snowbirds flock to the Sunshine State to escape the frigid weather up north. It's true that Florida beaches are the perfect location to spend your time looking for that tropical vacation experience, but with so many other, more popular destinations like Miami or Fort Lauderdale, I wondered, how did this small coastal town, that's not even in the middle of the Panhandle, become so popular? Leave it to MTV, of course. In 1986, MTV made its first trip to Daytona Beach with the debut of their new show called MTV Spring Break. It launched at the Plaza Hotel in Daytona Beach. And I remember this, I watched this show and I love researching these cases because I learned so many new facts. This was a live show that MTV used to broadcast for 8 hours a day during spring break. It featured live music performances by famous bands and musicians, plus all the other spring break-related antics, bikini-clad women, alcohol, and lots of hot-looking co-eds. The president of MTV at that time, Doug Herzog, said this about being at spring break. He said, "Spring break is a youth culture event, and we wanted to be part of it for that reason. It makes good sense for us to come down and go live from the center of it, because obviously the people that are there are the kinds of people who watch MTV." And it's true. They were definitely hitting their demographic. By the 1980s, other coastal cities in Florida, like Fort Lauderdale, started to discourage college students from spending their spring and summer breaks on their beaches. It brought a lot of destruction, crime, and chaos to the beautiful cities, while the mayor of Daytona at the time, Larry Kelly, saw this as an opportunity to have his town on the map and invite tourists to his beach instead. It was all about business. But sometimes seeing green can blur your vision to the dangers and downsides of such an open invitation. Daytona actually started to market itself as the destination for spring break for tourists back in 1989. It was a huge moneymaker. A typical spring break in Daytona brought in $160 million back then. in a mere 3-month period, and an estimated 400,000 spring break vacationers, mostly college-aged individuals, who came there to run wild. And I can tell you this, the locals were not fans of this at all. In 1993, the biggest stars at the time were performing on MTV's Spring Break show. Joey Lawrence, I remember him, was the host, and some of the performers were Warren G. on his regular tour, Stone Temple Pilots, Eminem, Xzibit, and Dr. Dre, just to name a few. Of course, this was a major event. Just look at this picture. This is a bird's eye view of one of those performances in what they called the band shell. It kind of looks like a castle. And look at all of those people. However, Chrissy and her friends weren't going to Daytona for MTV. They just wanted everything else that came with the spring break capital that MTV had put on the map. Chrissy's trip wasn't until April, which was about a month after MTV was going to be there. It wasn't just the core group of girls making their way 1,000 miles from New York to Daytona. It was a group of 17 of them, guys and girls. The plan? Driving separate vehicles as somewhat of a caravan and getting a bunch of hotel rooms at a really cool hotel that's close to the beach and has everything. They picked the Howard Johnson Hotel on Atlantic Boulevard. It's right on the beach, just steps away from the ocean. Just look at these views. It makes me miss Florida. It's called the Plaza Resort and Spa now, but it's close to everything. Lots of bars, restaurants, clubs, music venues, and of course lots of other spring breakers there for the exact same reasons. The road it's on, A1A, is lined with hotels and gift shops catering to out-of-towners, and it was the perfect choice for Chrissy's group. So, what did Frank think of this? His 20-year-old daughter taking a trip so far away from home? Well, he trusted Chrissy. Even though he said she could be impetuous at times like most young adults are, she was also responsible and firmly grounded. Just 5 weeks prior to the trip, her father was proudly sharing the fact that he was so overjoyed that Chrissy had accepted Christ into her life. Besides that, they were going as a group. What could happen to a group of them? It was as though a piece of home was coming with Chrissy. They'd have one another, they'd be safe. On Friday, April 9th, 1993, the group of 17 Rochester guys and gals arrived at the beautiful Daytona Beach, Florida beaches to spend the next week having the time of their lives. Chrissy and the girls checked into their room on the 13th floor, and I'm sure there was an amazing view. Then they made their way down to A1A to get acquainted with the place they'd call home for the next several days. By the next day, Saturday, they were ready for their first full beach day and party night. They didn't really want to go out the night before because they wanted to be well rested and ready to dance all night long at the most popular nightclub in Daytona, Razzles at 611 Seabreeze Boulevard. They saved their energy for Saturday night, which was also one of the busiest and best nights to go there. It's still a super popular venue today. Their website says Razzles is Daytona Beach's hottest nightclub and has been electrifying Daytona Beach for over 3 decades. There's even a dedicated spring break tab on the website where you can click to see what to expect when visiting Razzles, which they say is the spring break headquarters for over 35 years. It definitely looks like a party to me. It even advertises free drinks until 10 p.m. This place is packed most nights, where you're literally crammed in shoulder to shoulder. Their Facebook page, as of February 22nd of this year, was looking for security guards for this upcoming spring break season, so it's still jamming. The place is huge too. It's over 15,000 square feet. There are a number of different rooms, tables, booths, lounges, VIP sections, bars, and dance floors to choose from. The best part, it was only a 2-minute walk from their hotel, right around the corner, which made it super convenient, especially after drinking all night at Razzles. You can be 18 to enter, but you must be 21 to consume alcohol. Chrissy was only 20, but she brought a fake ID with her from New York so that she could bypass the restrictions. Back in those days, it was really easy to get your hands on a fake ID. Not only that, but they looked completely different than the driver's licenses today. After spending all afternoon at the beach, the girls headed up to their room. They showered, did their hair and makeup, got dressed, and then headed out in their group to Razzles around 9 p.m. as soon as the doors opened. They got a table, ordered their drinks, and started dancing the night away. There's a lot to see and experience in a big nightclub like this. Lots of new people, loud music. Though they did come as a group together, they weren't glued to one another all night. Last call was announced, and the group met back up at the table. That's when they noticed that Chrissy wasn't there. Her friend Rita jumped into action immediately. During the night, the girls had been separated a number of times, but each time they made their way back together, so Rita just figured that Chrissy was somewhere in the crowd. She went looking around, asking friends if they had seen her, and one of their friends from the group said they remembered seeing her around midnight, talking to a guy and leaving. Rita and the girls did remember seeing Chrissy walk off a couple of times, but figured, you know what, she's gonna be back. Of course, when you're busy having fun, time kind of slips away, and you don't always keep track of your adult friends' whereabouts. As a matter of fact, none of them were even concerned about Chrissy leaving. In their minds, she was living it up, having a good time, and maybe continuing the fun elsewhere. No big deal. So they made the 2-minute walk back to their hotel, figuring she would surely show up soon. At some point, the girls drifted off to sleep, and by the next day, Easter morning, on Sunday, April 11th, Chrissy still wasn't back. They didn't have cell phones back then, so they couldn't reach out by text or call her. There was no social media or Find My Device apps. All you could do was wait. So that's what they did. They were going to wait until Chrissy made her way back to the room. The girls asked some of their other Rochester friends if Chrissy had crashed with them in their hotel rooms, but she had not. They knew their friend, and they figured, you know what, she's probably having a little too much fun with the guy she met the night before. If something was wrong, they figured Chrissy would have called the hotel by now. They were a little surprised that Chrissy would choose a guy she didn't know over spending her vacation with her best friends. But they figured, what could they do, right? It was her choice. They weren't going to wait around and let the sun go down without getting out there on the beach and enjoying every minute of it. So, they left the room and headed out to the sand, assuming they'd see Chrissy anytime now, prancing down the shoreline with a story to tell them about last night. They still really were not that concerned at all. But they should have been. What Chrissy's best friends didn't know was that earlier that same morning, around 7:06 a.m., 30 miles southwest in a sleepy bedroom community called DeBerry. I've heard that phrase before, but I never knew what it meant. A bedroom town refers to a small town tucked away from the city. It's a place where people move for cheaper rent, but it's close enough to commute into town for work. They live there, basically just to sleep, and they spend most of their time elsewhere. Makes sense. I'd never heard of this town before either. It's located in Volusia County, about 45 minutes inland from the hotel where the girls were staying. And this area is definitely like night and day compared to Daytona Beach. Much more residential, rural in nature, spread out, with way less going on. That Easter morning, a resident was on his way to work when he saw a flash of something white in the grass along a very busy road called Turkston Drive. It was out of place enough for him to stop and take a closer look, so he did. From his vantage point, he thought he could see a woman lying on the ground. He raced to the nearest convenience store to call 911. Officers made their way out to the road just outside a wooded residential neighborhood, and sure enough, they saw something that appeared to be a deceased human body. A few minutes later, Officer Greg Arthur, a crime scene investigator from the Volusia County Sheriff's Office, got a phone call. They told him to go out to the scene. It was the supervisor of the major case unit that handles homicides in that area. Officer Arthur had been to many crime scenes. He had seen his fair share of very gruesome murders, but he had to compose himself when he arrived on the scene in DeBerry that holiday morning in 1993. Seeing her just lying there, curled up on her side, the strikingly beautiful woman, there was just something about it, like a sleeping beauty frozen in that moment. Lifeless, yet with the air of potential she could have had in life, had she had the chance to live it. The officer was overcome with emotion. This was someone's child. He had so many questions, but he had to pull it together so that he could find the answers. The first thing he noticed was the blood. It contrasted against the white baseball jersey that she was wearing. She had it on, in this picture, with a pair of shorts taken the night before. Hours earlier, she was smiling and laughing with friends, and now it was soaked with her blood. It was pooling underneath her head. She still had her purse in her hand. What was she doing on this road? And who would have wanted to harm her? It was clear that she had been shot, and it appeared the wounds were on her head, but there were no other distinctive marks on her body. Could she have been walking here at night and been ambushed by someone? There was a very noticeable and fresh tire track right next to her body in the grass. So Officer Arthur used a cement-like substance to make an impression of this track. While the coroner arrived to transport the woman's remains to the medical examiner's office, they also recovered a spent shell casing, which was located around 4 feet away from where she had been lying. Since her purse was collected at the scene, they were able to look inside and get their first lead, a clue about her identity. But it wasn't crystal clear who she was because they found 2 New York State identification cards, one with information about a 26-year-old woman, and the other for a woman named Christine Lazaro, who was only 20. Now, Officer Arthur thinks he knows who their victim is, the young girl, the 20-year-old, in town for spring break. It doesn't take long for him to match her face to the younger woman's ID, and it makes sense. She would have wanted to have this fake ID so she could drink, especially because she was on this vacation from out of state. It's not uncommon at all. Plus, there was a big clue on the top of her hands, stamps from a nightclub. But she's so far from anywhere with a happening nightlife, so it's a mystery how she ended up this far inland. The officer knows she was most likely staying in Daytona. Now, he has the dreadful task of notifying next of kin about the devastating reality that their loved one is dead. Frank was the first one to get that call. It was unbelievable to him. He kept saying, "No, no, no." That's all he could get out of his mouth. There wasn't anything else to say. It was going to take him a while to come to terms with what the officer was telling him, and they still did not have much information to provide. However, Frank was able to give them some information. He confirmed what Arthur had suspected. Chrissy was on a trip to Daytona Beach with her friends. He gave the officer the name and location of the hotel they were staying at. Chrissy's brother didn't get the chance to hear about his sister's death from a loved one. He saw it on the news. He said he would never forget seeing the EMTs loading a body bag into an ambulance, and that had to be extremely devastating. I cannot begin to imagine the pain of someone you love dying tragically, but to find out about it on TV like that, I can't help but feel so sorry for him. Meanwhile, back in Daytona, it was close to 5 p.m. when the trio made their way back to the hotel room from spending the day at the beach. They had to be back to get ready for dinner reservations that they had made before the trip. They had planned a nice Easter dinner at a fancy restaurant. But where is Chrissy at this point? The girls start to talk about how they're feeling in regards to the fact that they feel like Chrissy has just abandoned them and all their plans on this planned vacation. It was a holiday, and they were all looking forward to this night. Chrissy had helped pick out the restaurant, planned the event, and she even set out a special dress. It was hanging in the closet. So what's going on? What could be more important than this plan with her closest friends? They just didn't understand it, and it started to annoy them. They were just trying to make sense of it all. I mean, they weren't thinking that their best friend was dead, that's for sure. They thought that she had opted to spend time with someone else. Detective Jody Palermo was assigned as the lead detective on the case. He didn't understand what a spring breaker in Daytona would be doing in DeBerry, nearly an hour away from the beaches, and why she was just left there, not even covered up. It was as though she was dumped out of the side of a car door and just left there, thrown away like trash, and that was heartbreaking. What could she have done to make someone do this to her? Well, the only lead he has is the information given to them by Chrissy's father. So they made their way to the Howard Johnson's hotel, looking for her friends. Time is not on their side. Those first 24 to 48 hours are crucial, and it had already been 16 hours by the time they set out to find her friends. Kelly, Lauren, and Rita had made it to dinner, but there was just this eerie feeling around them. Rita had this wave of fear come over her at one point. She couldn't just sit there anymore enjoying this night without Chrissy. She turned to the other two girls and said, "This is serious. Something isn't right. Something's wrong. We gotta go." And they left to go back to their hotel. That gut feeling was right. When they got to their door, they saw a business card in their hotel room door. It was from Detective Palermo. At this point, they felt a little relieved, but then it turned to concern, like, what did Chrissy get herself into now? The girls were thinking she got arrested, maybe for having a fake ID or something worse. They didn't have much time to put it together, though, because just as they stepped inside, the investigators were back at their hotel room door. Without hesitation, one of the investigators pulled them together and said, "Girls, there's no easy way to say this. Christine is dead." That's unbelievable. It was so difficult for them to hear this. That is not what they were expecting. All three of them just stood there, speechless. They were in shock. Their minds went completely blank. They didn't know what was going on. Rita actually thought the detective might have been speaking a different language. It sounded foreign to her because it wasn't making sense. But when she looked towards Kelly and Lauren, she knew and just broke down. All three of them broke down, hysterically crying. There were so many emotions and thoughts racing through their heads: shock, guilt, sadness, and then the realization that they'd never see Chrissy again. They'd never hear her laugh or ask for her style advice. They were so young and alone, far from home, and now knowing their best friend was never going back home with them, it was a lot for them to take in. But there was no time to grieve in that moment, because detectives needed the girls to pull themselves together to help them understand what happened to their friend. The girls explained the last time they saw Chrissy. It was the night before at Razzles. They didn't see her leave, but friends of theirs said that she left the club with a dark-skinned male. He could have been Hispanic or African American, but he wasn't someone from their group. However, they did say this: Carl, the guy Chrissy had been seeing, matched that description. He was African American, but he was supposed to be in North Carolina. Still, it was only a 6-hour drive, so could he have surprised her and come to Daytona? By 7 p.m., the autopsy report had come back. The manner of death was homicide, and the cause of death was 2 gunshot wounds to the head. There were no signs of forced intercourse or any other physical harm to Chrissy's body. No defensive wounds, nothing. However, the medical examiner did find something on Chrissy's body, a clue left behind. Remember the stamp I mentioned on her hand from Razzles? The medical examiner could still see the R on one of her hands. But on the other hand, there was another stamp, one that her friends didn't have. It wasn't from Razzles. It was smudged, but he was able to make out 3 numbers, 701. That's the name of another hotspot in Daytona Beach, 701 South, a nightclub inside the Texan Hotel on Atlantic Avenue. Present day, the hotel is called the Harbor Beach Resort. It's about a 6-minute drive from Razzles, or about a 29-minute walk. So now investigators know Chrissy wasn't just at Razzles that night, which means the guy she left with might not have been the last person to see her alive. She could have met up with a lot of people. This case is becoming very confusing because there doesn't seem to be a motive. It's hard to imagine why someone would want Chrissy dead. They do have somewhat of a description to go off of, so now they can canvass the area where the body was found, plus the 2 nightclubs, hoping that someone saw or heard something the night before. Maybe someone would recognize Chrissy and remember who she was with, or if anything was out of the ordinary, if there was anything suspicious or wrong with her or anyone she was with. Then they get a lead. One of the servers at Razzles says she 100% remembers Chrissy. She even told detectives what Chrissy was wearing that night. "Oh, I remember her. She was wearing a white baseball jersey, had long dark wavy hair, and shorts on. She was with a black guy. They were sitting right at my bar together, right here, and he was wearing a dark blue shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap." The server said they were having a very good time, very close, they looked like a couple. The guy was very polite, buying her drinks. Everything looked normal. Wow, okay. So this really did sound like it could be Carl. Maybe he came to surprise her after all. So they get the credit card receipt from the server, and when they look, they see the guy signing with the initials BC. That's definitely not Carl's initials. The server pulls up even more receipts, and they see that the full name is Brent Cole. So, they contact the credit card company, pull up all of Brent's information, and find out he's a college student from Minnesota. They figure this guy was probably vacationing in Daytona, just like so many other students that week. Now they need to track him down ASAP, because this could be Chrissy's killer. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood where Chrissy's body was found, a resident said she remembered hearing a bang around 4:30 in the morning, followed by the sound of a vehicle racing away. She returned from Easter Sunday service later that afternoon, and that's when she saw the crime scene tape. She connected it to the gunshots from earlier that morning. But another resident said gunshots were super common in the early morning. It's a rural area, and hunters are out there shooting vermin. It wasn't much to go on. They were just trying to create a timeline, tentatively saying that Chrissy could have been murdered around 4 a.m. By the next day, Rita, Lauren, and Kelly had decided to take the 1,000-mile trip back home, ending their spring break vacation early. They couldn't cope with Chrissy's death all the way in Florida, far from their loved ones. Of course, their families were worried about them. They felt so guilty about not being there to protect their friend. They worried about Chrissy's family and the pain that they were going through. They just had to get back in town. It was equally as hard to leave, though, because this was the last place that they spent time with Chrissy, and they knew she would never be going back home. Not alive, anyway. Frank definitely wasn't taking a while. I don't know him personally, of course not. But from the interviews and everything I read and watched, he reminded me of my own father. He couldn't help but want to get down there to Florida himself and start looking for the man who killed his little girl. But then he said to himself, "What am I going to do? I'm just going to go door to door and say, 'Did you kill my daughter?'" So he realized this wasn't logical. He wouldn't be much help. It was so hard to sit back and do nothing. He was angry, sad, and anxious to know what happened to Chrissy. Investigators were about to knock on Brent Cole's apartment door at this time. Without warning, they had already made their way to Minnesota. They couldn't wait to get a good look at this guy who was last seen with Chrissy Lazaro. When he came to the door, he was well-dressed, clean-cut, polite, not what they were initially expecting to see. He agreed to speak with them. They informed him that they were there to investigate a murder, and he looked really confused, like, why in the world would these guys be coming all the way here? This is the woman we're looking for, Chrissy Lazaro. And of course, when someone hears that they're being interviewed about a murder, it makes them nervous. In Brent's case, confused. He's like, "I don't have anything to do with that." He's looking at the picture, and he denies knowing Chrissy or anything about what happened to her. He was in Daytona. He says he was on spring break and did go to Razzle's nightclub. He also had drinks with an attractive brunette that night, but she's alive and well, Jennifer Weathers, his girlfriend. The detectives weren't going to just take him at his word, but he goes one step forward and says, "Look, here's a picture of that night of me and my girlfriend." When Detective Palermo looked at that picture of Jennifer, his jaw dropped. He could not believe the resemblance to Chrissy. It was unbelievable. They could have been twins, and they were wearing the exact same outfit that night. Wow. Jennifer was there to speak to the detective herself, and she explained that they were there on that Saturday night, having drinks at the bar together, but they didn't see Chrissy, and they went back to their hotel room together, alone. So now, everything that the detectives thought they knew about Chrissy leaving the club wasn't accurate. Her friends most likely caught a quick glimpse of Jennifer and Brent, not Chrissy and another guy, leaving together. But she did go to the 701 club that night without her friends. How'd she get there, though? And who was she with? The friends were re-interviewed, and though they were given this new information, they held strong to the fact they knew they saw Chrissy leave with a dark-skinned man that night, and they knew it was her. Regardless of whether there was another couple that looked similar, they definitely saw Chrissy leave with a similar-looking guy. The detectives went to the 701 club, and they asked the staff if they recognized Chrissy. They brought a picture with them and showed it to all of the people, especially the bouncer, the manager at the door. The manager recognized Chrissy right away, and there's a reason. It was because of the guy she was with that night. He was giving the bouncer issues. As soon as they walked up to the door, his ID didn't quite look right, and the bouncer wanted to ask him a few questions. This guy kind of took offense to it. He snapped back at the bouncer. It's the manager's job to keep her patrons safe, and she looked at Chrissy and could tell she was nervous and scared. At that point, the manager made a mental note of this guy's appearance in case anything else were to happen inside the club that night. He was muscular, medium-built. He had high cheekbones, dark skin, a mustache, and what she described as having a very distinctive Arsenio Hall-style haircut. Now, if you're not familiar, he was a famous comedian and talk show host back then, and to me it's like a high flat top fade. Tell me what you think. Here's the picture. As you can see, it's unique and distinctive. You'd definitely remember it if you saw it. So now that they have this feature to go on, they interviewed the staff members from the 701 South Club, and they recalled seeing Chrissy and the guy having a great time together. He was a complete gentleman. She definitely wasn't there against her will. But since they had seen him get kinda loud with the bouncer, who knows what he was capable of? Maybe he had a short fuse, and something happened after he had a few drinks in him, and they left the bar. The manager was able to provide a sketch artist with every detail that she could recall, and they created a composite and started taking it all over the town, asking if anyone had seen this man with Chrissy. No luck, so they released the sketch to the media. Now, this is the one I was able to dig up from old newspaper articles. The ones that I saw on shows were completely different, so I truly believe that this is the one they handed out and plastered all over the news. And it started to bring in a bunch of tips. One was from a guy who said he had seen this man. He frequented strip clubs, according to this guy, up and down the coast of Florida, last seen in Orange County. So this is the biggest lead that they've had at this time. Investigators go and they hand out flyers with Chrissy's picture and this guy's picture to clubs, regular clubs, bars, and even strip clubs from Daytona to Orange County, which was about an hour away towards the Orlando area. But they still do not get any leads. On October 17th, a week after Chrissy's body was found, she had been sent back to her family in New York, and they were finally able to lay her to rest. They had a beautiful memorial service at Pittsford Community Church, and over 500 people came out to mourn the loss of Christine Lazaro. Childhood friends, college friends, family, relatives, co-workers, they piled into the church to pay their respects. Frank was blown away. He said, "Holy cow," when he looked at the crowd. However, Chrissy's mom, Kathleen, declined to participate in the service. A family representative said she was not ready to talk about what happened, so she sat at the back of the church. She was too overwhelmed by her daughter's death, and she wanted to grieve privately. There were about 20 people who spoke about their memories of Chrissy and what she meant to them. Frank said that Chrissy was trusting and curious. She embraced life and explored it. But he had a message for everyone, something he thought Chrissy would have wanted them to hear, a word of wisdom and caution so that her loss was not in vain. He said that she would have wanted her friends to learn from her murder. His message was, don't drink and drive, don't do drugs, and don't make hasty decisions, with an emphasis on the last one. Frank said, I know for a fact she would say, use the buddy system. This was in reference to the fact that Chrissy broke away from her friends. She was left alone. If someone would have been with her, if someone would have been watching, if they would have used the buddy system to alert one another of their plans to leave and not have left anyone behind, she might still be there. Her dad was haunted by his daughter's voice. He imagined her calling out to him in her final moments, saying, Daddy, Teddy, help me, and knowing that he couldn't be there for her. That just broke my heart. It's gut-wrenching. A friend of Chrissy's named Brad Denker didn't want to speak at the actual funeral, but he did send a poem into the newspaper that he wrote about Chrissy, and I wanted to read it to you. I remember a face of beauty with eyes that would grab your heart and a smile that shined like a star in a blackened sky. Sounds of laughter and kindness that could enchant a room and bestow happiness on those around her. He ended with, we love you, Chrissy. She was very loved and lost way too soon. Detectives were determined to find the person who did this to her, but every lead that they had went cold. That's when they turned to someone more closer to home, Chrissy's boyfriend, Carl. He did somewhat match the description, and he was only 6 hours away at the time, so they tracked him down to ask him about his whereabouts the week Chrissy was in Florida. His coach made a statement with proof of a roster that showed that Carl was in South Carolina playing a game the night that Chrissy was murdered. But still, there were hours after that were unaccounted for, so they still needed to speak with Carl himself. And it was a good thing they did, because when they do, they get their next lead. They fly out to South Carolina to meet with him, and he's visibly distraught. Just like Frank mentioned, Carl is very polite. He cooperated fully. Unbelievably, he tells the detectives he spoke to Chrissy the night she was murdered. No, he wasn't in Daytona, but she called him sometime in the middle of the night. He was asleep when he answered, and he estimated it was between midnight and 2 am tour. She sounded just fine and bubbly, happy. She told him she was having a great time, but she missed him and wanted to reach out and say hello. He said they chatted for about 30 minutes. Detectives asked if he could tell where she was calling from, and he said he was sleeping and there wasn't much he could say. He didn't hear a lot of loud noise in the background. It wasn't a bar, but he could hear a TV on, and he didn't hear anyone else. Back then, in order to make a long-distance phone call, especially when you're out of town, you bought what's called a calling card. It basically has minutes on it, and you type in a number before the number that you want to call and be connected to, and that's how you pay for long-distance charges. While Chrissy had one of these, they traced the calling card, and they see that late-night call. It was at 1:30 in the morning, but they can't trace where it came from. But the 701 South Club is in the Texan Hotel, and the timeline would match up. If Chrissy left Razzles around midnight and made her way to the Texan, she could have placed that call either before going to that club or afterward. Maybe she was with someone that was staying at the Texan and she was in their room. It had been 10 days, and they were still no closer to knowing what happened to Chrissy, and that's when Chrissy's friends gave detectives some information that they thought was not that important in the beginning, but maybe now it would be. Remember the first night the girls got there and they kinda laid low? Well, Chrissy kinda didn't. She went down to the hotel bar all by herself to get a drink alone, and when she came back, she told the girls that she met a really hot bartender named Scott Henson. Now, the girls had already mentioned this to the police, but when they said he was white, they ruled him out because it wasn't a priority to check on since she was seen with a dark-skinned man leaving the club that night, or so they thought. Chrissy's friends said that she and Scott had exchanged numbers. They planned to meet up sometime that week. But Chrissy couldn't wait. She decided to go out with him that night after her shift ended. However, she came back alive and told her friends that they just walked down the beach and talked. They go to speak with Scott at the hotel bar, and he admits, "Yeah, I went out on a late-night walk with Chrissy." When they show him a picture, that's when it finally hits him that she's the spring breaker they found murdered on Easter morning. He tells investigators he was not even in town that day. He left early Saturday morning, a day before her body was found, to celebrate the holiday with his family out in Georgia. They confirmed his alibi. By now, all the locals in Daytona Beach are scared. Chrissy's death happened the last week of spring break when many of the students that flocked to this area were finally leaving, and her murder started a debate, including the mayor, who was now realizing that Daytona's reputation as a place to go and let loose and party till you pass out with uncontrollable crowds was really damaging the city's image. He felt it put an undue burden on the police and the community workers who had to clean up all the mess that was left behind. But others in town who wanted their town to thrive pointed out that it brought in way too much money to worry about that, and it would make up for all the troubles that the spring breakers may bring. They pointed out there hadn't been a murder in 13 years. Sure, there were petty crimes and hotels got trashed, but they argued, did anyone turn up dead until now? No. Well, an officer named A.J. Tolley from the Daytona Beach Police Department said, "Listen, the reports of men forcing women to have sex with them against their will and other indecent incidents were being reported more and more. In just March alone, there were a dozen reports. It doesn't look good for the city, but more importantly, these are victims and they're coming forward. And yes, someone did die. Just 2 days afterward, there was already a headline in the front page of a local newspaper that said, "Time to de-emphasize spring break." It looks like the mayor got more than he bargained for when all he saw was dollar signs chasing after those MTV viewers. The case they were referring to, that happened 13 years before, this was the murder of Carol Ann Barrett. She was an 18-year-old from Ohio who was on spring break in Daytona in March of 1980. Just like Chrissy, she had dreamed of spending her vacation in the sun. She also traveled with a group of 8 of her friends, and they all stayed at the Treasure Island Inn Hotel on the beach, just like the one Chrissy's friends were in. In Carol's case, she was partying in her hotel room with her group of friends when she and a guy decided to leave and go to a store down the street. When they were going down the hotel hallway, a man stopped them at gunpoint and forced them to open their hotel room door. He wasn't expecting to see all those people inside, but he didn't care. He proceeded to tell all of them, guys and girls, to strip down. Then he robbed them all and tried to kidnap a girl named Pam, but she started to scream, so he took poor Carol instead because she was calm and quiet. Then he forced the rest of them, the whole group, onto the balcony, where he locked the sliding glass door behind him. They were stuck out there screaming. No one was coming to help them. So one boy climbed onto a neighboring balcony and was able to knock on the door and get the people inside to call the cops. Unfortunately, it was too late. Carol's barely clothed body was later found on the side of the road, 100 miles away in Jacksonville. She, too, was shot in the head, like Chrissy. This case is still unsolved despite the fact that a number of her friends had seen this man who took her and could give a clear description to the police. Both Chrissy and Carol had execution-style deaths. These are the type where there's no time to fight. You don't even realize you're going to be harmed. You're defenseless, and you're not expecting it to happen. It's quick, but it's no less horrifying. Now, there's one more similarity between these two cases. They were both cold. 4 months go by, and Chrissy's family is desperate for answers. They put out a $100,000 reward for any information that would lead them to her killer. No one comes forward. By September, Chrissy's brother Frank finally makes his first public statement. He was at his aunt's table, talking to reporters for the very first time. There were pictures of Chrissy all over the house, even one from the night she was killed, wearing that white baseball jersey. Frank said, "Why couldn't I protect her?" That's something that bothered him. She was all alone. His little sister didn't have a chance. The fact he couldn't be there to save her haunted him. He told reporters that the pair were always there for each other. It was as though they knew what the other was feeling or when they were in trouble. Frank was 23 at the time and a student at the University of Rochester. The loss of his sister had torn him apart. He said it was the hardest thing he ever had to go through. She was a friend, not only a sister. He described it as crippling, like a part of him was gone. Frank wanted to make one thing clear. It wasn't Chrissy's fault that she was killed. Many people had questioned why she left without her friends at night and placed the blame on her. Frank said that tarnished his sister's memory and that she was portrayed poorly by the media as an underage partier, a boozer, and even a drug addict, which she wasn't. He said she was a typical 20-year-old, doing what everyone else her age was doing. Victim blaming often occurs. She should have done this. She could have done that. Frank acknowledged that it's easy to judge, but insisted, "We don't know what position she was in. We don't know what we would have done in a similar situation." He emphasized that we can only learn from these situations, and that is one of his goals in telling these stories. It is not Chrissy's fault that she was murdered. The only person that's responsible for that is the evil person who chose to commit that crime. She wasn't a bad person. As a matter of fact, she was someone who was always there for others. She was the type to never say goodbye without saying she loved you. Frank recounted a time when he was really sick, and Chrissy was by his side all night. She even fell asleep on the floor next to his bed, taking care of him. His message was, "Don't take things for granted. Don't take the people you love for granted." He said that the relationships he has now are treasures he values more than ever because you don't know how long they will last. He also mentioned he was trying to heal, and that he thinks Chrissy would have told him to go live his life with the energy and excitement that she did. He was trying, and he ended with, "Someday, I hope I can do that." It's bittersweet, and I think it's a great takeaway. We don't know how much time we have with anyone else, so cherish every moment. In this case, those moments turned into months and then years, and Chrissy's family and investigators held on to the hope that one day, with advanced technology or some other method, her murder would be solved. It wouldn't be until 2010 that someone who was keeping a secret about Chrissy's murder would finally be compelled to reveal the truth. 17 years after Chrissy was found dead, a call came into the Volusia County Sheriff's Office. It was April 20th, 2010. Warden Burl Kane from Louisiana State Penitentiary was on the other end. This penitentiary is better known as Angola. You might have heard that name before. It's the name of the slave plantation the prison is built on. It's a very famous prison, and the warden there at the time held the key to solving the case, a key to an inmate's cell. They were housing 38-year-old Romulus Gordon, who was serving 2 back-to-back life sentences for being caught on CCTV robbing Lucky's Truck Stop Casino in Louisiana and murdering 2 women execution style. Assistant manager Schaefer Francis, a 29-year-old mother of 2, and a 64-year-old woman named Brenda Granny Robertson, who was an unarmed security guard. Romulus was a regular there in 2006 when the crime occurred. Schaefer, the 29-year-old he gunned down, was a hard worker who never complained about her shifts at Lucky's. She was the first to volunteer her time to help others and always had a great attitude, according to her friends and family. She was willing to take on extra tasks, and everyone that knew her said she was also an amazing mother who was always by her daughter's side. Now, she was gone. During her time as the assistant manager of this small casino, Schaefer monitored the flow of money from poker machines that were emptied by their employees and distributed that money to players as change. Math and numbers were her thing. This was her passion, and she enjoyed her work. In her free time, she spent time watching movies with her boyfriend. Romulus Gordon's other victim, Brenda Robertson, the 64-year-old, weighed less than 100 pounds, but was the one who always helped Lucky's stay trouble-free. There hadn't been any trouble until this double murder occurred. Schaefer and Brenda had a great working relationship and loved one another like family. No one at Lucky's Casino had ever felt threatened or unsafe, so these murders were a shock to everyone. The prosecution in this case was initially planning to seek the death penalty against Romulus. However, he pleaded guilty to Brenda and Schaefer's murders in exchange for 2 life sentences for first-degree murder in 2007. While he was serving that sentence, he heard a sermon from a visiting pastor named Jim Savala from the Brooklyn Tabernacle in New York City. He visited Angola once a year, and this sermon inspired Romulus to write a letter to the warden. It was laced with biblical references, like this one where he said, "How can I praise God on one hand, and in my heart and mind I know what pain I've caused someone for years and years. God sent me here for a reason, and until I confess what I have done, I cannot be freed from the belly of the whale." He said in his letter that the programs at the prison made him realize that you can't run from your past. He wrote, "All my family problems and sickness were because of my secret. I want to confess what I have done. I have all the details that only the murderer would have. I want to confess now. Now I'm going to hurt my own family by telling you the truth." But at the end he wrote, "Give the family closure. It's the right thing to do." That closure came in the form of confessing to the warden that he killed Christine Lazaro. Romulus told details to the warden about the murder that had never been released to the public, like that the shots were fired at close range, one to her cheek and the other above her ear. The warden relayed all this information to the police department, and they ran his name. They discovered that Romulus Gordon had been arrested on a trespassing charge just 40 miles from DeBerry, where Chrissy's body was dumped on the side of the road just 2 months after her murder. When they arrested him, they confiscated a .38 caliber weapon, which was the same caliber used on Chrissy. Naturally, they tried to find this gun. They wanted to see if it was still in evidence. However, it had been so long, and because they didn't know it was connected to any other crimes, especially a bigger crime, it had been destroyed. Detectives flew out to Louisiana to speak with Romulus to make sure he was telling the truth. Right away, he became very emotional, and the detectives did not think he was putting on a show. By this time, the inmate worked as an orderly at the prison and was in charge of making sure that other inmates who had committed disciplinary offenses were on their best behavior. Romulus had a really good conduct report and truly seemed to want to just get the secret off his chest. Once they believed they had their man, they had a lot of questions, the biggest one being, why? He explained that he was 21 years old at the time and had moved to Orlando about 4 months before the murder. He was on the run from police in Louisiana. One night, he was having fun hanging out in Daytona for spring break when he ran into Chrissy at Razzles. They started chatting and were hitting it off. He really liked her, and they were having a great time. To impress her, he lied about what he did for a living, claiming to be a rich record producer. They left and went to the 701 Club to grab some food, then headed to his motel room out in DeBerry. According to him, they had sex together, and he had also done a lot of cocaine and had been drinking all night long. Chrissy made a phone call while he went to the bathroom to do some more drugs. When he came out, he saw Chrissy going through some of his things, which included a couple of his fake IDs. He had warrants for his arrest and was using an alias at the time. When he saw her doing this, he became super paranoid, believing she was going to turn him in. Initially, he claimed he was just going to drop her back off in Daytona Beach, but instead, he freaked out. According to him, on the way to drop her off, he told her to get out of the car, and that's when he ended up taking her life instead. It's a completely senseless motive. There was never any indication that Christine ever had intercourse with him or with anyone before her murder. So I'm not really sure I believe that this is exactly how things went down. If I were to give my perspective, it would be mere speculation. We will never know the truth. But I find it hard to believe because it reminds me of the Samantha Josephson case, where there was a big struggle, unlike in this case. Romulus wrote a letter to Chrissy's dad asking for forgiveness, which was something that wasn't easy for Frank to read or come to terms with. How could he forgive the man who had callously taken his innocent daughter's life? But he's a Christian and thought about it. He realized he wasn't the ultimate judge, so he was able to extend forgiveness to this man. However, Chrissy's friends did not feel the same way, and I tend to side more with her friends on this one. After hearing that someone had confessed to Chrissy's murder, it brought them back to that day in the hotel room when they first got the news. Rita said she hates Romulus. It doesn't matter if he's sorry. He doesn't bring Chrissy back, and he doesn't fix anything. Kelly expressed gratitude that he confessed, but believes he should pay for taking away their friend and for taking someone's life. And he will pay, he is paying. A year later, on May 25th, 2011, Romulus Gordon pleaded guilty to Christine's murder. He was given yet another life sentence in Angola prison. This was a case that Detective Palermo, who was now retired by that time, had never forgotten. He was so happy that the family could get closure and to know that Chrissy's killer was behind bars forever. He doesn't think this case would have ever been solved. They put so much work into it, but without this confession, they probably would never have known who killed Chrissy.